The biologist and intellectual E.O. Wilson was once asked what represented the most hindrance to the development of children. His answer was the soccer mum. He did not use the notion of the Procrustean bed, but he outlined it perfectly. His argument is that they repress children's natural biophilia, their love of things. But the problem is more general. Soccer mums try to eliminate the trial and error, the antifragility, from children's lives, move them away from the ecological, and transform them into nerds working on pre-existing soccer mum compatible maps of reality. Good students, but nerds that is, they are like computers except slower. Further, they are now totally untrained to handle ambiguity. As a child of civil war, I disbelieve in structured learning. Provided we have the right type of rigor, we need randomness, mess, adventures, uncertainty, self-discovery, near-traumatic episodes, all those things that make life worth living, compared to the structured, fake and ineffective life of an empty suit CEO with a preset schedule and an alarm clock.
What a quote from Professor Nassim Taleb in Antifragile. If you, like us, you're not a fan of the empty suit CEOs or the IYIs, intellectual yet idiots, as Taleb calls, and, for example, even on this point of soccer mums and raising children, you care about, you want to raise anti-fragile kids. You're generally looking for positive stresses. You're looking to gain from disorder. Then the best way one can position themselves is by gaining Lindy knowledge. And where do you find that, Iman? It's rationalvc.com.
Of course,
where you get every episode we release, in addition to an essay after every episode, which is a summary of our learnings with a story that we send out to subscribers with exclusive content. So that's rationalvc.com. And let's get into this episode. So, Antifragile, what do you make of this book?
I feel like after every single time I read one of his books, and we have obviously read the two previous books that come in the Inserto series, that is Fooled by Randomness and The Black Swan, and we've done podcast episodes on those two books, megasodes, if you will, that have actually been promoted by Taleb himself on Twitter, or X. So go and check those out before you listen to this. We highly recommend you go and check the previous ones out because they inform a lot of the concepts we talk about in this podcast. But having said that, I think this is possibly his most complicated book. And that's because he gives a lot of information, but presents it in a way that is really easy to digest once you've got to the end of the book. So it's like everything becomes circular and comes together by the end of the book. And actually, a lot of the things that we've read in his previous two books, Fooled by Randomness and The Black Swan, tend to be concepts that don't necessarily pass what we would term the sniff test. So at first, you're like, well, hold on, this doesn't make sense, this concept he's talking about. Like a black swan in and of itself, it's like, how can you not predict something? And then you learn about narrative fallacies and all this stuff, and you realize, oh, us humans are just feeble. But with this book, I immediately felt that everything passes the sniff test. You're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, that completely makes sense. And I don't know whether that's because we've learned a lot of the stuff from his previous books, or it's because the way this has been written in and of itself just really aligns to how humans innately think. So to answer your question, it's fucking complicated, man.
Yeah, so this is, if you're watching on video, these are my highlights from the book, where it's basically, genuinely, there are like so many pages where I wanted to break the pen, because I'm like, what's the point of highlighting? I'm highlighting everything. Just like last time I said, everything is signal. Literally everything's signal. And I'd read a few pages.
I've done economics graphs preparing for this one.
You didn't even do that you did not even do that in uni. So it goes to say, like, I mean, going back to the autodidactism point and why, look how curious and excited we are just by this, which, I mean, he criticizes traditional conventional education a lot in this book. We're going to get into so many things. I don't know how long this episode is going to be. We're not in person, so I can't troll you about some things, and you can't troll things like my shoes or attire. But
I can still troll your attire.
Even overseas, on a stream.
For those listening and not watching, Cyrus and his big head has put this polo Ralph Lauren, no plug. You know, we don't get sponsored by them, but he's put that on his head, And then he's got a nice Talebian Ralph Lauren shirt in bright pink with white stripes. That's also beautifully Talebian. And he's got the Fat Tony chain, which is actually, if you want to explain what that is, but he's got his Fat Tony chain with the Fat Tony hairy chest as well.
It's just Ahura Mazda, Zoroastrian, ancient Persian religion necklace.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, anyway, as I was saying, as always, you cut me off from my beautiful monologue. All right, let's get the usual, the disclaimers and the preface out the way. This is not a book review. This is rather our interpretation. Every episode, we explore a Lindy book and we find ideas that one can use, whether it's in business and life, mix a bit of our own stories and experiences in it. As I was saying, I've highlighted pretty much everything. I'd read 2 or 3 pages and I'd sigh. I'd put the book down, get up, go outside into like the German forest, look at the skies, look at the trees, and just ponder on things. Like genuinely, every one of his books, and this was, he said himself, this is his central work at some point in the prologue, I believe. It's so much food for thought. As the saying goes, it's better to, read the same 150 books over and over again. I think when I read this, I was like, why should I even read anything else for like the next 2 years? I should just keep rereading the inserto. And as I said, I'm a pleb. I'm figuring it all out. You're joining us on this journey. The books of the Inserto series by Taleb, in addition to Poor Charlie's Almanac, these 6 books basically shaped the Rational VC brand since inception. The philosophies of our brand, the teachings, everything has shaped the Rational VC brand. Therefore, these 6 books are we covering first, and then we'll go on to many other Lindy books. But because these 6 books are so important, we'll be coming back to them again and again, a year from now, 2 years from now, where we redo these episodes with improved understanding and learning and maturity in life as you have more life experiences. With each reread, you take away things that you hadn't even taken away before. So we're going to redo these. We're figuring it out. And yeah, you guys are going to join us through my experience of highlighting every single line of this book. So with that out of the way, do you want to maybe explain how it's actually multiple books in one book? So 7 books in one book, if that makes sense. The structure of this book, and as Taleb says himself, the way he likes to name the contents and the chapters and everything is so that charlatan journalists cannot kind of take away just from skimming the contents and the blurb what the book will be about to just write some BS review. So because he is allergic to journalists, because they are IYIs and no skin in the game charlatans, he rather just, it's a collection of essays more so, and he kind of groups things into related topics. So you have 7 books. So, you're reading and then it suddenly says book 2. You're like, what? Book 2. So do you want to maybe explain really quickly before we get into it, like maybe the structure of that and then how we're going to structure this episode?
As you said, Taleb likes to have this approach to his book writing, which is you can't really understand the book unless you've read it. And I think this is the first time that he terms different segments of the book as books, if that makes sense. So to give a bit of background, when he writes books, he tends to do so with minimum structure. So as a typical autodidact, he'll follow his interest as he writes a book. So for example, we've mentioned in previous episodes that when he was writing Antifragile, he took a step back and then decided to write The Black Swan whilst he was writing Antifragile.
It was Fooled by Randomness. Yeah.
And come back to Fooled by Randomness once he'd written The Black Swan. He goes on these intellectual journeys. So my reading between the lines of what he's done here, as opposed to how he may have explained it, is that because he's trying to provide tangential but not necessarily connected concepts across different books that look at the fallacies that the human mind tends to fall for and how that applies in the business and investing world, he comes up with these often, let's say, interesting structures to his books. So aside from the, throwing off the scent for journalists who don't read the book, I think he's also doing it because he kind of he's being true to who he is, creating this kind of complicated mesh of his concepts in a book. Putting that aside, what we've tried to do in this podcast is give you an overview of the core concepts he discusses in this book. Some of these concepts apply in the other books as well. So what you'll find in Antifragile is he builds a lot on the concepts of the Black Swan. And of course, there's a running theme of being fooled by randomness and what that means in the context of antifragility as well in this book. Having said that, I think there are 13, probably 10 to 13 different things that you could hang your hat on and say, oh, this is an interesting concept that he brings up in this book. So we'll go through, as the first part of this podcast, those 10 to 13 different concepts. Then I think what we will do is get a little bit more granular, go into the definitions of what he's talking about and how the story evolves in the book. Bear in mind, again, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, what we're not trying to do here is regurgitate the book back to you. We highly recommend, in fact, we suggest that you don't listen to this unless you've read the book in the first place. So go and read it, because you will come away with your own thoughts. But then once we've sort of given you an overview and then deep dived into each chapter, we'll probably then, on top of that, even go further and more granular, talk about the different sort of parts of the book that we enjoyed, the different quotes that we really like, and how that all applies to our lives and our experiences. To recap, we'll jump into the core concepts, we'll do a deep dive, which will come later on in the podcast, and we'll give our views of everything that we believe and our experiences inform us of when it comes to the book.
All right, so I think the first thing is, let's get into the definition. We have this triad. It's not really a image or diagram, but we can throw up some. If you're watching, we're not going to throw up many things on the screen, even though Iman's drawn lots of lovely homework charts and graphs for himself. But we are going to throw up a couple of things, or a few of the key tables. The first thing we have relates to the definition of antifragility, where we have this. We start with the prologue. The prologue itself contains so much important information. The definition. Do you want to run us through the triad, and then I'll jump in as well?
The first question is, as ever with any book that's got such an interesting title as Antifragile, is what the fuck does it even mean? And he gives us a very concise, which is actually quite rare for Taleb, by the way, a very concise explanation of what antifragile actually is. So he explains it in terms of a continuum, a spectrum of what things are in the world, right? So how things react to certain situations. That continuum is fragile, is the first part. The second part is robust. And then the third part is antifragile. The reason he gives this continuum is because antifragile doesn't necessarily have an explanation that is in and of itself. It has to have a relative explanation. Because when you talk about fragility, you're talking about something that basically just breaks. It just cracks under the pressure of different stresses and shocks, right? You know, that could be the human body. Like if you get crushed by something, you're going to die. If you get hit by a car, the likelihood is you're going to die. It could be a corporate job. If the company decides that its costs are too high, it can get rid of you very quickly. That's a fragile situation, right? Then you've got robust. Robust things are things that don't care and can withstand shocks. That could be something like being a self-employed individual, right? Your reputation is not necessarily fragile in that situation. It's robust because you can go and get other customers if your reputation gets, there's an issue with your reputation with one specific customer. The final bucket is antifragile, which are things that actually benefit from stresses. So you've got this concept of a robust situation, which is it doesn't get damaged, but it also doesn't get better. Antifragile gets damaged and then gets better as a result of the damage. You could think about it as a YouTuber is quite interesting as someone who is antifragile, and we'll talk about this later on in the pod, or a podcaster, because on social media, you can say the most outrageous shit and people can pile on top of you, but in reality, that's only making you a better YouTuber or social media person, because that shock is increasing your capacity to be successful in that realm. He gives other sort of historic examples like Damocles versus a phoenix versus a hydra. And, like if you cut the head of a hydra in Greek mythology, 2 heads grow in the place of that 1 head. So that's a completely anti-fragile concept. Whereas if you talk about Damocles, which is the story of where, there's a sword hanging over him, and that represents a single stressor. If you cut the rope holding the sword, he's dead. So he's completely fragile. Give me your view of what you think about the anti-fragile definition.
Yeah, so Taleb, he's given some talks on this himself, and he covers this in the book as well, which is, if you're sending a parcel and it's got, I don't know, let's say plates in there that they'll break quite easily. So you put fragile on the box. And then he says, okay, so he asks, what's the opposite of fragile? You're not going to write on the box robust, because most people initially, when you ask someone, okay, what's the opposite of, imagine you've never heard of the term antifragile, you say, what's the opposite of fragile? They would say, I don't know, robust. And he's like, no, you you'd say on the parcel, rather than writing fragile, you would say please mishandle, because the point is, if the parcel is fragile, you don't want the things inside it breaking. If they break, they're fucked. And the reverse holds true as well. If you put please mishandle, it means, well, it's going to gain from that mishandling, that disorder, throwing it about. So therefore, the opposite of fragile is not robust. The opposite of fragile is antifragile, where it gains from disorder. Because robust means it's not affected, but it also doesn't gain, whereas antifragility means it gains from the disorder. And so he quickly summarizes, one of the many parts I have highlighted, it says, and we're not going to read many things from the book, but it says, on the left, in the fragile category, the mistakes are rare and large when they occur, hence irreversible. To the right, mistakes are small and benign, even reversible and quickly overcome. They are also rich in information. So, a certain system of tinkering and trial and error, hint, hint, startups, online businesses, etc., a certain system of tinkering and trial and error would have the attributes of antifragility. If you want to become antifragile, put yourself in the situation loves mistakes, to the right of hates mistakes, by making these numerous and small in harm. We will call this process and approach the barbell strategy, which we'll get onto later on in the episode as well. But we've spoken about the barbell before in another episode. And what you find here is all of Taleb's books, they kind of continue on from each other, and they interlink so much, which is why I recommend, you do actually read in the order of Fooled by Randomness, which was first published, then Black Swan, then Antifragile, and then even the end of this book, he started touching on Skin in the Game, which is the next episode we'll be touching on. So yeah, I think in terms of the triad and the definition, that's an overview. But as we go into the book more and more, the idea will really cement. It's not as basic as, it is as simple as what we've explained, but with concrete examples and discussions, your eyes really open up, which is why I said every few pages I'd have to go outside and look into the sky and ponder, because it's not as simple as what we've just said. You link it into real life, and he is all about real world, as his Real World Risk Institute name suggests, and he's all about real world risk. So yeah.
The importance of understanding what the triad means in the context of this book is essentially just the first step, as you say. But I felt that once you understood the triad, and he introduces it so early in the book, like you say, basically in the prologue, I think it is in the prologue, right?
Yeah. But he has a table too.
We'll yeah, like you say, we could link to the table if we can find an online version. It's actually quite a long table. It goes across multiple pages. So I don't know how we'll show it, but we'll show it somehow. This was the first time I'd read a Taleb book that immediately I grasped what the content of the book was going to be, because he'd written it in a sort of different way to how he's written the other books.
Yes. I was going to say, this was his first book where, you remember his previous books, Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan. At some points I said to you, there are parts where the reading was difficult, but I push through, and then it becomes an absolute joy. You're just like, wow, like much wow, as we say. One of Taleb's, I believe, acquaintances or friends or someone who's attended Real World Risk Institute, she commented on my Black Swan copy that had, as usual, all the 50 million sticky notes. And she said, oh my God, I can't believe it. Look how much he's highlighted. I threw my book in the bin with frustration after like a few, and then obviously she went and eventually read it with patience. But you feel a little bit of frustration, but it's because, as with anything good in life, it comes on the other side of, pushing through the, I don't know, you're going to call it a bit of, it's not really difficulty. But this book, I don't know if it's because Taleb had been writing more, he'd spent a decade now in the limelight at this point. It reads so much smoother than the prior two books. And as you say, for me as well, instantly, you just don't want to put it down.
Okay, now that we've given this sort of definition of what the triad is and how antifragility fits into that triad, I think it would be useful if I just run through quickly some of the other things that we've kind of picked up by reading this book, this masterpiece, and then we can deep dive into each one of those as some of the core concepts that we've taken away. So I think the next bucket of stuff he talks about is how this triad works in real life, right? To your point around what this means in the real world. So removing any ceteris paribus or other things that are not important from the calculation. So basically trying to create something that is applicable in the real world, as you say. And that falls in across three different things, I think. The first is this point around what is termed hormesis, and the concept of non-linearity, which we become familiarized with in the Black Swan. The second is modernity, and how modernity in and of itself is fragile, which is very, very interesting. The third is this point around that builds on hormesis and fragility, and it's naive interventionism, and I believe it's pronounced iatrogenics.
Yeah, it's iatrogenics or iatrogenics, as he said in his Google talk, but
yeah. So when
tomato.
I got confused. So then there's this point around.
I'm going to troll you for
naive
your
interventionism.
Immigrant pronunciation.
Look who's talking. So hormesis and non-linearity, then modernity and fragility, then naive interventionism and iatrogenics. So those are the three next buckets. After that, what we'll discuss is basically my favorite concept from the book that made everything click for me, which is convexity versus concavity. After that, we'll then go into his answers for the Black Swan. At the end of the Black Swan, you're kind of left a little bit fuzzy as to how to deal with Black Swans, but he gives a really good overview here. After that, we'll go into, further benefits. So that's things like optionality and what that means in the context of wealth. We'll then rediscuss the barbell strategy, which we discussed in our previous podcast because it applies so well in this context. We'll go into the introduction of our most favorite phrase, the Lindy Effect, and what it means and why he starts introducing it here. We'll talk about the green lumbar fallacy. We'll talk about the importance of data, but its pitfalls when it comes to signal versus noise. We'll then talk about the thing that clicked for me the most across this whole book that made me think, oh, this is why Taleb and Munger are so related, the concept of via or via negativa. And then we'll finish with an element of what does this mean in an ethical sense? What are the ethics of antifragility and fragility?
I think we're going to be here for 5-6 hours, who knows how long. You may as well, I don't know, halfway through go and get your macronutrients and your protein and calories, probably a few pee breaks. But yeah, let's kick off with, as you say, these sections. We'll go through them maybe a high level, and then we'll go more granular. So hormesis, he says, a word coined by pharmacologists is when a small dose of a harmful substance is actually beneficial for the organism, acting as medicine. A little bit of an otherwise offending substance, not too much, acts to benefit the organism and make it better overall as it triggers some overreaction. So, this was not interpreted at the time in the sense of gains from harm so much as harm is dose dependent or medicine is dose dependent. And he goes on, he gives, I have a note here regarding hormesis and depriving systems of stresses being a bad thing. You want to talk, it's so timely that I touched on your calories, right? So you probably remember this part of the book. I mean, this is still in the introduction, and he says, since abundance would bring the opposite effect, this episodic caloric restriction can be also interpreted as follows. Too much regular food is bad for you, and depriving humans of the stressor of hunger may make them live less than their full potential. So all hormesis seems to be doing is re-establishing the natural dosage for food and hunger in humans. In other words, hormesis is the norm, and its absence is what hurts us. I don't know how much of this we want to connect to the idea that, take a shot, Naval, he talks about a lot of modern-day humanity's problems come from abundance and not scarcity. But don't you also realize how much of reading Taleb, every book that you read more and more, you realize... I mean, Naval's a G. A lot of why we do what we do, which is chasing the leverage multipliers of code, media, and capital, is due to his teachings. But when you read all of Taleb's books, you realize Naval got much of his ideas from Taleb.
He even says it himself, doesn't he? He says,
yeah. He says he gives a lot of props and cred, and he actually Naval liked our last episode as well. So the larger point is that we can now see that depriving systems of stresses, vital stresses, is not necessarily a good thing and can be downright harmful. So that's how he wraps up that section on hormesis.
The reason I grouped hormesis with modernity and fragility and then with naive interventionism and iatrogenics is the following. When you look at modernity, Taleb essentially critiques what modern life is because those very stresses, those natural stresses that you talk about, are removed so as to make life easier, whereas in effect, what that's doing is having the opposite effect. It's making life harder. And this brings us to naive interventionism, which is the same thing. So he talks about the risks of removing stressors and how that can have an impact, in particular in complex systems where we do not understand the implications of what we're kind of messing with. And this is where iatrogenic harm comes in. That term in and of itself is specific to inadvertent harm that's caused through medical treatment or intervention that is unnecessary, or that is deemed necessary at the time but then becomes clear has just added a way more issues down the line. So he talks about, medical side effects and over-treatment and over-diagnosis and all of this stuff. But the thing that really made it click for me is where hormesis and iatrogenics and naive interventionism fall together is this concept of antibiotic resistance. By using too many antibiotics, what ends up happening is the bacteria that you're trying to kill become completely resistant across societies, across the world. They become super resistant to that antibiotic and therefore become even stronger than they were before. And therefore you're creating a situation or a scenario that's even worse than what it could have been. I think, is it in this book or is it somewhere else I read that he says the worst thing you can have or the most dangerous thing you can have is a personal doctor, because
it's in this book, yeah.
Yeah, so he says like the worst thing you can have is a personal doctor because they can kill you with all legal reasoning imposed. So like there's absolutely no reason why they couldn't kill you and not go to jail. So it's just like, it's quite a funny little
talks about like, I think you can relate this to the uber wealthy who are the type, or let's say your mafia mob boss who's like, yeah, doctor comes to my house. And if you have your own personal doctor, exactly as you say, you're susceptible to more harm. And I think I'm trying to recall, we're going to go through all of these chapter by chapter anyway, but again, a lot of this book is jumping around as always with Taleb's ideas. They all link into each other. But if I recall somewhere, he said, if you're diagnosed with something serious, then it's better to get like the opinion of 10 different specialists or doctors. And we're going to get into, there's a chapter on medicine and of course the problems with the medical industry today. So,
do you know what's funny is that if you're particularly Asian parent who loves your child going into medicine,
yes,
the reality of the situation is you've got shit that just loves randomness and stresses and uncertainty, and all of that comes with time, which we'll come on to when we talk about Lindy as well. But all of those things are like important to create something that's anti-fragile, whereas medicine kind of, he's insinuating or even saying quite clearly here is actually medicine is the opposite of this, and it's not actually supporting people in particular go through the stresses required to actually like be healthy, which just sounds so counterintuitive when you say it, but then when you think about it, you're like, yeah, fuck, I don't need those paracetamols or antibiotics or whatever, like I'll just get over it. This is a genuine reason why like I don't take much medication. Like I'd rather have a headache than try to null the pain. And I know that's a stupid example, but it like mentally it helps you build resilience.
Yeah, Americans come to mind first before anyone else. It's probably popping so much.
Shots fired.
Americans, a lot of people, but especially Americans, when people are sick, they reach instantly for paracetamols, ibuprofens. In America, you have a whole host of shit over the counter available that you can't even get in UK or Europe. Like you'd have to get a prescription. It's not to say that you don't take the medication, but I refrained from taking antibiotics for a few years until, funnily enough, when we were recording the Fooled by Randomness episode, I was severely sick with it was the early stages of like a virus I'd caught during the Christmas period visiting London. What followed in the 2-3 weeks after that, and bedbound and like sweating absolute buckets, or I would say sweating swimming pools in bed. And then after 3 weeks dying of insane mucus and seeing doctors, and I was like, all right, I give in. All right, let me just give me the damn antibiotics. So like I held off for so long. But yeah, exactly as you say, if you're taking it sooner, what the example is, the antibiotics, for example, and you can apply this analogy to anything in life, the antibiotics essentially fuck up your gut microbiome. I'm not a doctor, clearly, but many of the, much of the strength within your immunity. So you're making a short-term gain, but long-term you may suffer through weakening. It's a stressor which brings fragility, you could say. It's not anti-fragile. You're not gaining from the disorder of taking an antibiotic in the long term. So that's what we're getting at.
And look, just to go back to your point around hormesis, so tell me if I've got this right, but the point I think he's trying to make is everything is in life can be random and non-linear, right? And so when you have a non-linear situation, the cumulative effect of these small stresses and shocks can have a very large and disproportionate impact. However, with hormesis, what you do is you sprinkle in these little small doses of stresses over time. So you build resilience, but in reality, you're becoming antifragile to those stresses. That means that they can't build up on you and suddenly wipe you out in a Black Swan event. And by being naive and intervening really quickly ahead of these things, especially with children, for example, you're taking away the value of hormesis in that specific scenario. Is that a good overview of what you think he's talking about?
Yes, correct. And talking of children, there's so much in this book that I've taken away about, I mean, if you're watching him on shaking his head and maybe excitement, disbelief, euphoria, how much I've learned about raising kids.
Do you know why I'm shaking my head? It's because there's going to be hundreds of sleep-deprived parents listening to, thousands of sleep-deprived parents listening to this podcast thinking, my guy, you have absolutely no fucking clue how
no skin in the game.
Yeah, no skin in the game, chatting shit, bro.
Soon come, bruv. Soon come.
I hope
I'm gonna have an army, a field. Okay.
God save the planet. All right. So should we move on to modernity?
I just wanted to, I'm so excited by this parts I've highlighted. It's literally written at the top. It says, ha at bankers. He says something about bankers, and me being an ex-banker, I have to take a dig here. I have to take my chance. Hey, you give me any chance, you know. Okay, so on that point,
before you continue, can you throw up? Can we throw up a picture of you in your banking days? As
all right, if you're watching, we'll throw up a few things for those of you who are new here or haven't been following us for a while. Here's me, I don't know, lifting weights under the desk while doing a financial model and having protein in my, I don't know, German streets
in
shirt
Lothbury.
With my calf leather Oxfords, whatever you want to call it.
He didn't have a beard either, so he had the slick back hair and no beard. And
yeah, it was like an Iranian golden gecko, so that's if you want to call it that. Anyway, in Lothbury, bank next to Bank of England, all of that shit. We're doing a charlatan job with a lot of charlatan frauds who are not aware. Taleb talks about, in the section where we're discussing hormesis, he has a small section, and I'm just trying to make a quick sense of, this is in book 1, which is the Antifragile Introduction, chapter 1. And where we touched on hormesis, right after he says, there's a section, domain independence is domain dependent. He says some people can understand an idea in one domain, say medicine, and fail to recognize it in another, say socioeconomic life. Or they get it in the classroom, but not in the more complicated texture of the street. Humans somehow fail to recognize situations outside the contexts in which they usually learn about them. And then he goes on to say something about bankers. He says, I had a vivid illustration of domain dependence in the driveway of a hotel in the pseudo city of Dubai. A fellow who looks like a banker had a uniformed porter carry his luggage. I can instantly tell if someone is a certain type of banker with minimal cues, as I have physical allergies to them, even affecting my breathing. About 15 minutes later, I saw the banker lifting free weights at the gym, trying to replicate natural exercises using kettlebells, as if he was swinging a suitcase. Domain dependence is pervasive. The shots fired are just absolutely, first is simply sublime. This is not even professional. This is maestro level. That point, it ties in a lot, actually. Okay, now that my excitement's, I got my excitement out taking shots at bankers and pseudo city of Dubai. But the importance here is you want to talk about, we want to link it back to, you mentioned Charlie Munger and Peter Kaufmann. They talk about, rest in peace to Charlie Munger, the GOAT. He always spoke of capturing the big ideas from all the major disciplines, like having a multidisciplinary approach to thinking, which is, all right, let's say, hypothetically, I don't know, you're an accountant or you're a doctor. You're not going to limit yourself, as most people do, just to that field. And what Peter Kaufmann did is he would have 6-month periods where every 6 months he'd learn about a different topic. So in the field of, let's say, biology, and I recorded, I think, before we started doing book episodes on our podcast, I don't know when it was, you can go all the way back to episode 16, 18, 20, something like that. I did an episode on Peter Kaufmann's approach, multidisciplinary approach to thinking. So for 6 months, he would print out every single biology interview in the Discover magazine in a big ring binder, and then he'd go and read these in the mornings for an hour in a coffee shop every single morning before work. And then in 6 months, he's captured the big ideas from the field of biology, because he's like, if you're being interviewed by the Discover magazine, you're going to be presenting to them over the next 5 to 9 pages of the magazine all of your best ideas in the interview. And so that's what he did. So he just read Discover magazine. And if you go to that episode somewhere, we have it on our YouTube channel, in the link in the description, I've actually found a PDF. I don't know how he found 144 interviews, but I managed to find like 90 of them or something. That's just one example. Apply that to any other field. There's endless courses online now about many different fields. If you're a doctor, you want to open a practice, you're like, okay, my accountant does all the accounting, or I have a little tax guy, or I have a CFO if you're running a large chain. But still, you still need to have an understanding of what's going on. And so one could take an online course, or apply this to anything basically. So the point is, domain independence is domain dependence. And I think it links to Munger and Kaufmann's ideas, capturing all the big ideas from the major disciplines. So that was a very good section.
The interesting thing that leads on from all of this is this point around modernity and fragility. So you mentioned this point around the pseudo-city of Dubai as an example, and he talks about Switzerland as the counterexample, right?
Yes, I love this section, as you know why.
So just to give an overview, the kind of definition of what he's talking about here around modernity and fragility is that modern life is a cesspit. These are my words. Modern life is a cesspit of naive interventionism and a distinct misunderstanding of what non-linearity means, and thereby, without hormesis and thinking everything's linear and deciding you're going to intervene in everything naively, you remove all the natural stresses of life and you make every system that is complex, which is almost every system in modern life, which is another issue in and of itself, is that we're just creating too many complex things. You make all of these complex systems more fragile. So if you think about the world as we have it today, there are many societal shifts that mean that we have an extreme reliance on what we could term as comfort. Everything is super easy for us. If you want to take a shit, you go into your toilet, you don't go into the back garden. If you want to make a podcast, you can do it with your mate over the internet really fucking easily. If you want an answer to any question, you can literally just Google it or chuck it in ChatGPT 4.0 now. So there is very easy systems for you to interact with. What sits behind that is extreme complexity to make those things available to you. Because as humans, we are completely unable to deal with those complex systems, and we have fallacies as humans, that means we don't really understand the non-linear impacts and potentials for black swans of those systems. You end up with a situation which is humans become overly reliant on these things and have an inability to deal with the potential black swans that emerge. The fundamental example that comes to my mind in the recent times is COVID. Even if Taleb has come out and said, that's not a black swan, that's a grey swan. And we all know that that's the case because Bill Gates was creating vaccines for this type of stuff. And he said as far as like 15 years ago, the big problem that's going to hit society is probably going to be some sort of virus. So even when we knew of the issue that was to come at hand, we still couldn't deal with it in the right way because we are fragile as a modern society. Do you want to give your view on this point around Switzerland? Because I know you've done a lot of research into where to live and what the benefits of living in different places are. So when he discusses this point around Switzerland, I mean, you immediately came to mind as someone who might have done enough research into, all of this stuff and what that means for a modern society being relatively anti-fragile or robust versus being completely fragile.
Yes. Before I do get into it, because you've linked here naive intervention with iatrogenics, and so I wanted to, and you've given some brilliant examples and discussions on iatrogenics. I just wanted to zoom out a little bit for people who are wondering what is this term iatrogenics, or the actual definition of it. And this is where Taleb defines it as, I would say, iatrogenics as harm caused by the healer, which can be extended to mean harm caused by intervention, which is this notion of, exactly as you said, the intervention causes harm. And the term originally comes from medicine. We touched on this, antibiotics. I mean, not always antibiotics, but in many cases, let's say you have a personal doctor who just recommends a load of shit that you don't need. It refers to the unintended harmful effects of medical treatment or advice. And so Taleb broadens this concept to apply to any intervention, particularly in complex systems, where well-intentioned actions can lead to unintended negative consequences. So you got me excited again because you mentioned this idea or notion of, I've researched a lot about where to live, and we're not going to say a lot, but we have, we like to take asymmetric bets. We have a little project on the side. We're brewing something at the moment around the idea of sovereignty and where to go to kind of live a life where you can legally pay lower taxes, not get screwed by your government, have lower crime, better place to raise your kids. All the questions we're always asking. Because if you're in the UK, I'm sure you're pretty worried about the future. Same as the US or many other Western countries. And so you're thinking about where to go. I researched a lot in the last few years where to go. Switzerland has its pros and cons, mostly a lot of pros. I may eventually still end up there at some point. The reason I decided initially to not pull the trigger was because the Swiss are very, very cold to outsiders. It's very hard to kind of integrate in their community. But with the shit show I'm seeing in, let's say, UK, West, Germany, US, etc., one would think that you'd still need to plan for the future and you may just have to take that regret of living in Switzerland. Taleb explains chapter 5. The chapter is called The Souk and the Office Building. And this really hit home because he says there are two types of professions. Consider the fate of Yanis, John, and Yorios, George, two identical twin brothers, born in Cyprus, both of them, currently both living in the Greater London area. The reason I resonate with this is because I grew up in the North London area, which has the largest Cypriots, Greek Cypriot population, or just generally Northern Cypriots as well, but the largest Cypriot population outside of Cyprus itself in the entire world. So I grew up around a lot of Greek Cypriots. And it's funny that I instantly laughed at the names because all of my friends would have names like Yanis would be John, Yorios would be George. And so the idea is John has been employed for 25 years as a clerk in the personal department of a bank, large bank. Clearly he's fragile. He's basically a corporate slave. And George is a taxi driver. So John has a perfectly predictable income, or so he thinks. Every month, $3,000 net deposit into his account, yada yada. Life is good until the banking crisis, when he realized that his job could be made redundant. Unemployment would seriously hit him hard. As a personnel expert, he has seen the implosions of long careers, with persons who, laid off at the age of 50, never recovered. And so his brother, of course, being the taxi driver, he may take dips in income, but year after year, averages is about the same as his brother in the long haul. So a cab driver some days may barely make any money, but then some days he may have 4 drops to the airport. It doesn't matter. In the long haul, year after year, he averages about the same as his brother. And he keeps moaning that he does not have the job security of his brother, but in fact, this is an illusion, for he has a bit more. This is the central illusion in life, that randomness is risky, that it is a bad thing, and that eliminating randomness is done by eliminating randomness. This really hits home because I am in a corporate environment. I've been in corporate environments a lot. You've been in corporate environments a lot. We've been in some of the best companies where people will salivate, they'll drool. They'll be like, oh my God, these brand names, like these, what are they? Not just intellectual yet idiots, but these CV builders, these CV circle jerkers. I don't know, I'm getting it all out. But it's all horse shit because, like, look what you and I have done the last few years. You could have stayed in consulting your whole life. What would have happened? There's a chance they had big 4 consultings had layoffs. And so what could happen is some people get pushed out. They don't make the partner track. And then what do you do at the age of 40 or 50? And then you have to do all this independent advisory bullshit. And then you're just kind of, you're still a slave. Like, you're still a slave. And so you decided, okay, I'm going to put one foot into the tech industry. We started this podcast. We started some VC investing, started writing essays online, building a network, starting an operating role, etc. And then me similarly have done a whole bunch of shit because my nightmare was to be another one of these fucking bankers when I was at SVB. Firstly, the reason I left is because I didn't look around and see anyone who inspired me. And this is exactly what happens, just like these 2 brothers, the cab driver here, the taxi driver. It's the illusion. It's the illusion that, you're taking the safe path. But actually, it's more stressful for us in the short term to be taking this. Some would say it's a jumping around path, or some would say, you're doing different things every few years. But actually what you're doing, you're hoarding so many different skill sets that you kind of gain from stresses. So in the future, when, I don't know, some old colleague of yours becomes redundant and his skill is not transferable anywhere else because he's an old fat cat. You and I, because we've accumulated some good skills, but by then even more skills, we have so many more doors open to us, which goes back to the whole notion of a lot of Naval's teachings as well.
There's one thing he writes which is so fucking brilliant because it reminds me of something in the Black Swan as well. At the end of this bit where he's talking about George and John, he says, George was used to having once in a while a crazy request, one he was free to decline. During the Icelandic volcano scare, when UK air traffic was shut down, he was asked by a rich old lady to drive her to a wedding in the south of France, a 2,000-mile round-trip journey. Likewise, a prostitute faces the small probability of seeing a severely infatuated rich client give her a very expensive diamond, or even an offer of matrimony, in what can be expected to be a short transitional period before her widowhood. Honestly, that quote cracked me up because it reminded me of him talking about, was it about Black Swan events? And he was talking about prostitution as well. He just sprinkles in these little hilarious random things to say that basically what he's doing is saying you're way more anti-fragile if you're a prostitute than if you're working for a corporate job or something, which absolutely made me crack up. But anyway, to let you continue, he then takes this point around volatilities of income and how what may appear as being far less volatile is actually far more volatile in the case of having a corporate job, for example. And then he applies it to political systems. And it's here where we start to see Switzerland, right?
Exactly. So the two brothers we just told you, John, Cypriot guy, corporate slave, George, Yorios, my guy, the taxi driver, anti-fragile. And Taleb says here, the centralized state resembles the income of John. The city-state models that of George. John has one large employer. George has many small ones. So Switzerland with its canton structure, right? So George can select the ones that fit him the best and hence has at any point in time more options. One has the illusion of stability but is fragile. The other one, the illusion of variability but is robust and even anti-fragile. And so he then goes into before I get into it, he says some funny stuff, but first we're still on Switzerland. He says, Switzerland is the most anti-fragile place on the planet. It benefits from shocks that take place in the rest of the world. It has its downsides too, because, he says here, it's a place for sheltering a lot of, let's say, aristocratic white Russians they later displaced. So he says, the main cities, such as Zurich, Geneva, or Lausanne, bear traces of the political refugees who went there for shelter, émigrés, from the Iranian royals thrown out by the Islamists to the latest African potentates executing Plan B. Even Voltaire spent some time hiding in the place, near the Swiss border, etc., etc. And he goes on, he says, so like Voltaire, there are refugees of other types, financial refugees, coming from places of turmoil, recognizable by their expensive and boring clothes, bland vocabulary, contrived decorum, and expensive shiny watches. In other words, non-Voltaires. So he obviously takes a dig at the Iranian royal family here, the Pahlavis, and others. And he says, this great variety of...
That hurt you, didn't it?
To be fair, no, it didn't hurt me.
All right.
I actually really appreciate, I think, anyway, it's a separate discussion. I like the Shah's dad and what he's done, but I do much prefer the Shah to the current regime. But he goes on to say, this great variety of people and their wallets are there in Switzerland for its shelter, safety and stability, but all these refugees don't notice the obvious. The most stable country in the world does not have a government, and it is not stable in spite of not having a government. It is stable because it does not have one. Ask random Swiss citizens to name their presidents and count the proportion of people who can do so. They can usually name the presidents of France or the US, but not their own. And so, what they do not have is a large central government, or what the common discourse describes as the government. What governs them is entirely bottom-up, municipal of sorts, as the cantons they have, the regional entities. And this goes to the central idea of what we were discussing, where I think you said to me, bring up the point of Switzerland, because we were discussing the bottom-up versus top-down, and we were linking that to your interventionism discussion, right? So I don't know what you have to add about this whole Switzerland piece and what I said.
The interesting thing about this is where, by definition, where Switzerland may appear as being something that's less stable because it does not have top-down power, much like, for example, a Britain would, or, the US may, even though I know it's got a federalized system, the federal system is basically run by one president. So you could assume, what you can assume around what he's talking about here is that by having more of a bottom-up approach to building something, particularly in the modern world and in modern society, you're far more likely to be able to create opportunities and systems where hormesis is more likely to occur. And in fact, because you have less structure and you are reducing the opportunity for top-down interventionism to occur, you're removing the dangers that may occur from naive interventionism and iatrogenics, as he talks about, in the non-medical sense. So that's why Switzerland was super interesting. But it doesn't come without its downfalls, like you say, which, he talks about the hideously glitzy scenes one encounters in Switzerland, in all of Geneva, parts of Zurich, and ski resorts such as Gstaad and St. So he says that there's no perfect solution to creating a country. A city-state is great, but you're never going to get the best of all worlds. So you need to be able to understand that there are downsides. That's why I really liked the Switzerland example, because he's talking about something that you can innately understand is complex. Sometimes when you talk about financial markets, everyone knows they're complex, but not everyone understands why they're complex. But when you talk about a country and building a country, I think that's way more innate to how humans can contextualize why complexity can be an issue, and why building bottom up is way more valuable than building top down.
Exactly. And you build bottom up, but then you attract the type of people he was talking about, which goes back to the point of, in life we must choose our regrets. And then lastly, just to wrap up on this bottom up thing, the whole point is, and I'm going to try and really summarize this, but he links this to non-linearity, the description from the prologue, and also what you touched on across the chapters. The problem is top down, where you have a centralized, like let's say a UK or whatever. The reason that is very fragile, and he talks about this being anti-fragile in some sort, is it's almost stable, because Switzerland resembles the second brother, the Cypriot brother George, the taxi driver, because the taxi driver has a lot of variations in his income. He's not like this corporate drone, his brother, who just has stable income and then suddenly nothing. Like, this takes us back to the turkey from the Black Swan, right? A turkey is happy for 1,000 days. It's being fed every day is the same. The 1,001st day, suddenly it's cut. The head is cut off for Thanksgiving, and it didn't expect that. It's a Black Swan event. Same thing happens to a banker or a corporate slave. What's happening in tech now with all the layoffs at big companies like mine, which I'll get onto another time, where all these heads are getting chopped off, all these people get made redundant, and so it gives the illusion of stability. But actually what is more stable is, like John, the taxi driver, has a lot of variability, but even until the age of 80 or 90, he works because he wants to, and it brings the days are varied, it's different. The income on average in the long term, if not, is more, because of, it averages out the same, and he works for longer. And linking back to the city-states, why the taxi driver brother, George, is like Switzerland, because he says here, a cluster of municipalities with charming provincial amenities, their own internal fights. So at the bottom, they have a ton of fighting at Switzerland, right? They have all these tiny cantons and tiny little villages in these cantons where people are not fighting, but they're always debating and voting on the tiniest of matters. So the smallest thing, Swiss people are always voting for something, like every week. So people are out to get one another, aggregates to a quite benign and stable state. So at the bottom, there's a lot of variability and noise and rustle and bustle and people arguing over things. But this means at the top, there's insane levels of stability. So Switzerland is similar to the income of the second brother, stable because of the variations and noise at the local level. Just as the income of the cab driver shows instability on a daily basis, but annual stability, likewise Switzerland shows stability at the aggregate level, as the ensemble of cantons produces a solid system. He wraps this whole Switzerland piece up with, I use the example of Switzerland to show the natural antifragility of political systems and how stability is achieved by managing noise, having a mechanism for letting it run its natural course, not by minimizing it, which goes back to the whole bottom-up approach, right, which we can apply to many things in life.
And he interestingly says that given that it might be the most successful country in history, it doesn't have as much, for example, university education as other countries, and everything is based on like how to do stuff as opposed to what to do.
Practice
so in other
versus
words,
theory, right?
Yeah, this point around, he says, in other words, on techne, crafts and know-how, not episteme, book knowledge and know what. So this whole point around vocation as opposed to theory is what he sees as being integral to building antifragility and creating resistance and resilience to potential black swans and breakdown. I think we've kind of covered most of the points there that he talks about from the perspective of, you know, everything from hormesis to nonlinearity to modernity and its fragile components, and then naive interventionism. I think the next thing that we should probably discuss is a bucket of two separate concepts. The first concept is this point around concavity versus convexity, which, you know, picks up on some of the statistical things that he speaks about in his courses, but also in the statistical consequences of fat tails, which is his one of his latest books that gives a more mathematical understanding of the inserto. But concavity versus convexity is super interesting because it helps put on a graph, on a chart, what this whole concept, you know, of antifragility and black swans means. And then the second thing I think is super interesting is closing out the loop on the black swan, which is by understanding all of these points around what antifragility is, how hormesis works, what nonlinearity is, what that means in the context of modernity and naive interventionism. You take all of that, you add the element of convexity and concavity, and then you start to get answers around how to deal with black swans, how to be anti-fragile in the context of a world that could lead to black swans. So why don't I maybe start with just this point around concavity versus convexity, and then we can move on from there.
Yep, start with those, and we can throw up a couple of diagrams or something, maybe not a lot, but two of your favorite graphs to depict or show these, and then we take it from there.
When you think about concave versus convex, you probably would have learned about these things in school. What you can think about as a concave graph is a graph that essentially curves inward, and then you've got convex, which is what I like to think of as, so like it shifts upwards. So when you talk about things that are going to the moon or going parabolic, this is what we mean by a convex graph. Now, if you assume that you have a y-axis, which is a certain outcome, it can be any outcome, but assume that your y-axis is outcome, and assume that your x-axis on this chart is a stressor. So it's any sort of bad thing that might happen, bad in, you know, quote unquote, however you want to take that word. But you have outcome versus stressor. Where you have a fragile environment, typically you'll have a concave chart. That is one where as the stressor increases, the outcome decreases. So you go across this line and the outcome becomes worse and worse as your stressors increase. That's fragile. What's antifragile is the complete opposite of that. It's a convex chart where the increased stressors lead to increased and better, you could assume, outcomes. That stops at a point. It's not forever ending. It's not parabolic forever. But for most things you can assume that are antifragile, that's how that works. Why am I talking about this? Is because the most important thing when you're discussing convexity versus concavity is that variance in the variables, so take any variable you want, variance in those variables is more important than what the average, what the overall tells you. And why this is important is because you could think about it in the context of volume, for example. I'm not going to get too mathematical here, but what will probably be more valuable to you for building strength, for example, is doing 1 rep of 100 kilo, let's say deadlift. Why? Because that teaches not only your musculature and your bones to lift that heavier weight, but it also works on your neuromuscular drive and everything that's related to your brain all the way through down to your nerves and down to your muscles. However, if you do 10 kilos 10 times, that stressor is maybe more hormetic in that it's, small stressors that apply over time. But what that doesn't do is necessarily provide you a convex outcome because the stresses may be too small and are not giving you the outcome that you require. So in that context, when you're training for strength, for example, doing a heavier weight with lower reps is probably more valuable. Why do I explain all of this? And I'll let you take the mic from here. Is that if you're investing, for example, in loads of early stage companies, like something that we like to do,
Rational.fund.
Plug there. The point is that over time, and assume that time is the maximal stressor, is the stressor that is the most important thing. So essentially your x-axis, remove that and put time instead of stressor. The longer a business remains alive and kicking, the more value you can accrue from that business. We can get into what that means in the context of the Lindy Effect later on, but for the purposes of this, the outcome is most valuable or highest when you push your time as your stressor as far out as possible. So optimizing for investing in startups that are more likely to survive than not survive tends to provide you better outcomes. Give you an example. If you've got a choice between investing in OpenAI, which has been around for 10 years and is now starting to see the public fruits of its labor, or a brand new AI company, and I'll make one up like Perplexity, I don't know how old they are, but which one would you rather invest in? The option typically would be, actually, I'd rather invest in OpenAI because time as a stressor has proven that these guys can create things, as well as having great teams, great products, and all of that good stuff. Mm-hmm. In the context of antifragility, you will find that almost anything that's antifragile will have a convex shape to that thing.
As I said, we've thrown up a couple of basic graphs here, but your convex is not exactly a U shape, but it's somewhat like a U shape in the sense that up until a certain point, it may actually be diminishing. It seems like what may seem like diminishing returns or lower returns actually, but then where the whole, as the crypto bros say, the hockey stick or to the moon or the parabolic, it inverses. So rather than so it's coming down with increased you want to say input or whatever or volume, and then suddenly it goes up with increased input. So the payoff is, exactly as you're touching on. There's like a inflection point, and I absolutely hate that fucking term. It haunts me still from banking bullshit days of all these charlatan greasy bankers trying to sell it to the banking committee to like, we need to do this deal. And in every single fucking one, especially when in the earlier days I was more junior and you have to take minutes of these fucking meetings. And then as I got more senior, I was like reviewing the minutes that other interns had put together. In every single one, it says inflection point. And so it's like yeah. And the other beef I have while we're on this topic is how banks literally just do all these deals based on bullshit forecasts put together by CFOs, and how Taleb just rips into forecasts. Basically, a lot of his work is just basically ripping into, predictability is BS, like thinking we can predict things, and how forecasts are BS, and how bankers are charlatans and also no skin in the game. So that's another. Every 20 minutes I have to get out my disgust for banking and the corporate world generally. Otherwise I start to have seizures. So that's I got it out. So sorry, please continue.
Okay, so why have I brought all of this up apart from giving Cyrus an opportunity to discuss his weird interest and disposition around banking? The reason we bring it up is important for a number of reasons. The first is that anything that we now speak about as being anti-fragile, you can contextualize it in the context of this like graph. So you can say, okay, fine. How does this very example we're talking about apply on a chart if you apply that lens of outcome versus stressor and how the line works? The second reason is the answer to the Black Swan. So let me just give a quick recap on what the Black Swan was, and then I can explain it in that context. So the Black Swan from the previous episode, and if you haven't watched the episode or listened to it, please go ahead and do so. It's very long, but I promise you'll take a lot away from it. And we've had a lot of positive feedback on that episode. A black swan, in its simplest terms, is an event that is highly unpredictable and has a huge negative impact. So by its very definition, you cannot as a human predict that this thing is going to happen. But what you will know is that it will have massive implications that are often negative for the person or people involved. What you can, however, do is predict the systems where black swans may occur. This is where this concept of convexity versus concavity becomes really interesting. Is the system you've designed convex to stresses? Can you throw little hormetic stresses at this thing, at this event, at this system, and get better outcomes as a result? What this can specifically create is you can move away from being a fragile system to becoming robust and then anti-fragile, or you can skip robust and go straight to antifragility. This is the first time that we've discussed non-stationary, a dynamic structure to antifragility, is that you can actually shift the shape of your graph, essentially. The reason this is important is because this infers that many things that you might assume as being anti-fragile in the first instance can actually change. And it's actually not necessarily anti-fragile, depending on how it responds to different stresses or issues that it faces. And typically there are 3 buckets that fit underneath this, and we can go into more detail around this later when we deep dive into the book. But this is the point around redundancy, around small and independent errors, and then around optionality. Redundancy in fragile systems is essentially this belief that what we expect as being the worst thing is typically based on what we've seen before. So this point around not being able to predict things because we haven't experienced them ourselves. So in order to be anti-fragile, you need to create systems that do not enable redundancy to occur. So you could, for example, look at nature and the human being. Why do we have, most of us have 2 testicles? Why do we have 2 kidneys? 2 arms, multiple fingers, 2 legs? Like, aside from some evolutionary purposeful reasons for having those things, the kidneys, for example, that's built in anti-fragility, or at least robustness towards redundancy. The second point is this point around hormesis, which is this thing around small and independent errors. Good systems create situations where small independent errors are allowed to occur in an uncorrelated fashion, which means, one, they don't build up on each other, those small errors, but what you get with those errors is an ability to tackle them as they come, this whole point around hormesis that we were speaking about earlier. And then optionality, the really good systems that then turn from fragile to anti-fragile tend to have optionality involved in them. We'll come to that later, but the black swan can essentially be stopped by applying these factors to them.
And then we have in, chapter 12, I believe it's Tales or Tales. Tales is sweet grapes. Tales is sweet grapes.
Teles, I think. But yeah, anyway.
Tales is sweet grapes.
We're so fucking immigrants, aren't we?
Teles was a philosopher.
Oh, shit.
A Greek-speaking Ionian or Phoenician stock.
Ionian,
tomato. As Taleb says, knowledge, schmonelage, whatever. Ionian of Phoenician stock from the coastal town of Miletus in Asia Minor. And like some philosophers, he enjoyed what he was doing. Miletus was a trading post and had the mercantile spirit usually attributed to Phoenician settlements. But Teles as a philosopher, he got tired of his buddies with more transactional lives, hinting at him that those who can do and others philosophize. And so he got really pissed off with this. And this is where Taleb kind of introduces the notion of fuck you money, which is a term we talk about a lot, written about, or the whole shebang. And so because he got tired of everyone picking on him, Thales performed the following prowess. He put down a payment on the seasonal use of every olive press in the vicinity of Miletus and Chios, which he got at low rent, right? So the harvest turned out to be extremely bountiful and there was demand for olive presses, so he released the owners of olive presses on his own terms, building a substantial fortune in the process. Then he went back to philosophizing. What he collected was large, perhaps not enough to make him massively wealthy, but enough to make the point to others, but also, I suspect, to himself, that he talked the talk and was truly above, not below wealth. This kind of sum I've called in my vernacular Fuck you money. A sum large enough to get most, if not all, of the advantages of wealth, the most important one being independence and the ability to only occupy your mind with matters that interest you, but not its side effects, such as having to attend a black tie charity event and being forced to listen to a polite exposition of the details of a marble-rich house renovation. So this is absolutely brilliant, this part. I don't know if you want to add anything to that before I continue with just a couple of points to do with Thales and linking it back to the optionality and asymmetry point that you were touching on.
What FU money essentially is we actually discussed this in the previous podcast, I think, or in Fooled by Randomness. I'm not sure which one, but maybe in both of them we discuss it, because he does introduce some of this before as well. But essentially he describes it as a way of achieving independence and the ability to only occupy your mind with matters that are of interest to you. So this whole concept of being able to navigate black swans, being able to create scenarios where you are living in convex environments as opposed to concave environments, the outcome of that is, in a financial sense, having fuck you money, but the way in which you get to that is through this point of optionality, if I'm not mistaken.
And getting on to optionality now.
Yeah, go for it.
So, as Taleb said himself, he discussed the formula in chapter 10, but it's pretty simple, right? So, simple I say, but extremely profound. Antifragility equals more to gain than to lose, equals more upside than downside, equals asymmetry, favorable, equals likes volatility. You are only harmed if you repeatedly pay too much for the option. But in this case, Thales patently got a good deal. And we will see in the rest of this book that we don't pay for the options given to us by nature and technological innovation. Financial options may be expensive because people know they are options and someone is selling them and charging a price. But most interesting options are free, or at the worst, cheap. And so this is linking a lot with a lot of the optionality in life and around us, and how a lot of it we are partaking without even realizing, and also a lot of it we're not even identifying, which this book, which I said to you, every few pages I just have to go outside and ponder, is I'm just like, you know the immigrant dad walk where you put your hands behind your back and you're just walking in your sandals outside and you're just walking up and down the street flaneuring, and I'm just pondering and thinking and scheming. I'm like, wow, these ideas are just so profound. I'm thinking of what's Rational VC going to be cooking up next. What opportunities what optionality do we have that I'm blind to? And then just to wrap up that section, this property goes beyond buying cheaply. We do not need to understand things when we have some edge. And the edge from optionality is in the larger payoff when you are right, which makes it unnecessary to be right too often. So that's the point there, linking it back to Thales and what you were saying about optionality earlier as well.
The interesting thing about optionality is that if you think about it from the perspective of wealth and money, you know, his idea of FU money is built on this point around maximum optionality. But actually, the way I like to think about it is a little bit more one-to-one. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the convex or concave graphs, they're curved, right? One curves outwards, one curves inwards. The optionality chart is probably just a straight line. So if you have optionality as your y-axis and wealth as your x-axis, what you'd expect is just a singular linear line going upwards. What you want to achieve is this beautiful, alignment between having as much wealth as you can possibly get whilst maximizing for optionality at the same time. So what you don't want is maximum optionality with very little wealth, because you then, by definition, don't necessarily have that much optionality. What you don't want is maximum wealth without any optionality, because how the fuck are you, you're a slave in that scenario. You might be a very well-paid slave, but you're still a slave.
Yes.
And he says something here, which is that greed is antifragile to income. Greed is antifragile to income. Greed, which is this negative thing, in and of itself is an antifragile phenomenon when it comes to income. You can accrue as much income as you want, but your greed won't change, and it will in fact get stronger as a result. And this is what he terms the treadmill effect, which is to say, if you do not increase your optionality as you increase your wealth in a one-to-one fashion, or if not even a little bit more, you will fall into this hedonic treadmill, and you will just keep buying shit you don't need, and the requirements of your life increase. And anyway, we'll come to this also when we discuss Skin in the Game, which is the next book. He talks a lot about this concept, but this is the most profound concept that I've taken away from Taleb in totality. Like, there's nothing that comes close to this specific concept, because, you know, he says slavery does not decrease with wealth and all of that stuff around Jamie Dimon, which we've picked on previous episodes. But this specific concept, when you put it on a graph and you say that greed is anti-fragile to income, makes you realize that you could optimize for every fucking penny and make as much fucking money as you want. But the reality is you ain't getting shit out of life because you're still a slave. His whole philosophy can, I think, be boiled down to that one specific concept.
Well, I'm excited because that means we're going to be building a lot of things and seeking this independence. But before we wrap up this entire section, there's a part where I just wanted to punch the wall from excitement when I read it, because it's still on the same section. Iman's laughing, he's pissing himself. It's on the same section where he says, so Thales, which I just explained, you know, he bought these olive presses and olive farm, whatever.
Do you know what's funny is that if you've been pronouncing that wrong the whole time and it's like Thales or something,
don't give a fuck. That's a form of optionality as well, right? Just not giving a fuck.
Actually, that's being robust.
That's robust. I'm not gaining from the disorder. Well, actually, people will take the piss out of us, maybe, share it around, be like, look, he's mispronouncing, it might be tailed, he's saying Thales, and then we gain from that attention, because any attention is good attention. Curtis Jackson.
Do you know the meme of actually?
Actually.
That's literally you,
You've thrown that up a few times now, I've noticed. I'm the actually guy. But anyway, so Thales, as we say, or tails or Thales. There are hidden options in our story of Thales. Financial independence, when used intelligently, can make you robust. It gives you options and allows you to make the right choices. Freedom is the ultimate option. Further, you will never get to know yourself. This is the most crucial part. This is all the reasons why I left banking and other roles, and the current role by the time this probably comes out, and why I'm so anti-corporate, and all the corporate little drones and minions and slaves around me never quite understand. This is the key point. He says, further, you will never get to know yourself, your real preferences, unless you face options and choices. Recall that the volatility of life helps provide information to us about others, but also about ourselves. Plenty of people are poor against their initial wish and only become robust by spinning a story that it was their choice to be poor, as if they had the option. And he goes on and on and on, but the key part here is what he's saying initially about how much you learn about yourself, and you know, you never get to know yourself truly. After leaving banking, the 4 years of stress that I faced from mingling or doing so many different things, skills, networking with different people, building different businesses, some failing, some doing pretty good, doing so much different shit. And also just even my upbringing, I'm so grateful for these years of, exactly as he talks about, you get to know yourself. Had I stayed in banking, my friends troll me. You guys all troll me for who I was when I was in banking. And typical banking ego, you think, you know, you're like, I'm the shit, I know everything. Like, it's kind of like, it's not mid-wit, but it's the meme of, at that point in time, you think you're the shit, you think you know everything. And then now it's like, the more I read, I'm just like, I'm just a fucking pleb. I know absolutely nothing. Like, the more you read, the more you realize you don't know a thing. And so
that touches on the concept of the anti-library, right, from the previous book,
Umberto
Black Swan,
Eco's,
which we talk. Yeah, exactly. Umberto Eco's anti-library,
exactly.
Which actually will throw up a tweet as well, where Taleb tweeted about this. He tweets about it quite often, but he's tweeted about it again, where he talks about, you know, rereading the same 100 books, but ensuring that those, you know, 100 books are changing over time, and you're able to understand how you're choosing the right books over time.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm going to be rereading the Inserter until death, probably, at this point. But someone on Twitter said how Taleb is, you know, in the last few decades, who's really been an original thinker, other than Taleb. You know, no one really comes to mind. But yeah, that was wrapping up that point. I think it's so crucial important for development of self-awareness to get to know oneself, likes and dislikes in life. Just it's a stressor in itself. When I didn't have that banking income, and then my income was varied, just exactly like kind of like the taxi driver, he says, or it's more volatile, there's more variability, and you learn so much more about yourself, and it also builds up some resistance, which goes back to the point of Naval, who said, once you get a taste of freedom, you become unemployable. Well, look at me now, did a few months of slavery. The whole world has heard me cry for the last few months. And I'm out again. I'm free. Woo! Let's celebrate with some San Pellegrino and electrolytes.
So let me just do a quick recap of everything we've discussed, because we've been going in a million directions, and I'm sure this is interesting, but also can be a bit confusing for the listener and watcher. We started by giving an overview and a definition of what antifragility is. We then used that to describe the combination of non-linearity, hormesis, naive interventionism and iatrogenics, and how that applies in the modern world and how modernity can be fragile. Then we went into the concepts of convexity versus concavity, and how things like redundancy in small independent areas and therefore optionality can help you solve issues surrounding the Black Swan. We then kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into what the pitfalls of wealth can be when it comes to optionality. I think moving forward, we've got a few more things to discuss. I think one of those would be the barbell strategy, which is essentially the discussion around how you create systems where you're taking advantage of convexity. Then after that, maybe discuss the Lindy Effect, which is one of our favorite words, and start introducing that ahead of Skin in the Game, which is also where he discusses that a lot. The green lumbar fallacy, which is quite interesting. The concept of signal versus noise in data via Negativa, which is again very, very interesting, and touches on Mungerisms. And then finally, the ethics of antifragility and fragility.
Let's do a quick pee break, because it's already been an hour and 45 minutes and we haven't even got granular yet. Okay, and back from the pee break, and Iman has also had his protein and macronutrients. So, I think before the break, you touched on all the topics that we've covered, and during the break, we actually quickly said to each other, this is actually where it starts to get really exciting. Like all the topics of barbell strategy, Lindy Effect, via Negativa, the ethics of antifragility linking into Skin in the Game, etc. So some people may be more familiar with these topics. If not, you've probably heard them thrown about. Let's get into barbell as the next one, because we just touched on optionality and pitfalls of wealth on the last topic. And to wrap up chapter 10, which leads into chapter 11, barbell, to wrap up chapter 10, this is a little bit of a summary. Fragility implies more to lose than to gain, equals more downside than upside, equals unfavorable asymmetry. And I've said this before, but I'll repeat again. And on the other side, antifragility implies more to gain than to lose, equals more upside than downside, equals favorable asymmetry. You are antifragile for a source of volatility if potential gains exceed potential losses, and vice versa. Further, if you have more upside than downside, then you may be harmed by lack of volatility and stresses. Now, how do we put this idea, reduction of downside, increase in upside, into practice? By the method of the barbell in the next chapter. So we get on to chapter 11. Now, chapter 11, which does get into the barbell, we've touched on barbell before. We've touched on barbell in as early as my angel investing essay 3 years ago, which we put out a few pieces of content since inception that kind of, you want to call it, taking our shot in Extremistan, kind of put our content on the map, more the brand on the map. I think that was one of them as well, for sure. At the time, it was probably the most viral piece of content we had created. I explained the barbell strategy, which we do in there as well. And Taleb here, and we've touched on it in the recent episodes, the Black Swan and FBR episode 2. But here he really goes into it. The barbell, or the bimodal strategy, is a way to achieve antifragility and move to the right side of the triad. So the triad, if people remember, is the three: fragile on the left, robust in the middle, antifragile on the right. So you're moving more from the left, more from fragility towards the right, towards antifragility. So this chapter is really interesting, chapter 11. It's called Never Marry the Rockstar, on this barbell strategy. And he goes on to say, monogamous birds put it into practice by cheating with the local rock star, and writers do better by having as a day job a sinecure devoid of writing activities. This chapter, called Never Marry the Rockstar, Taleb talks about how birds put this into practice, this barbell strategy. What do? They spend, and he says this in his Google talk, which is really funny. The whole crowd, all the nerds at Google laugh. And Taleb says, yeah, ladies, you want to marry the boring accountant. And then he says, oh, sorry, I'm not to say all accountants are boring, but you know what I mean. And then he says, ladies, you marry the boring accountant. So the bird marries, I don't know, Steve from accounts, something like that. And that's like the 90% side of the barbell. And then occasionally, once in a while, she'll sneak off to sleep with the rock star just for one night, and then comes back to her safe home where he's stable, provides the resources, but it might be a bit boring for her. So occasionally she sneaks off, sleeps with the rock star bird, and then comes back. And so this is the notion of barbell, which is with your investments. Taleb introduced this in the last book, Barbell Strategy. Let's say 85 to 90% of your investments would be in treasury bills, which at the time he was explaining to be like one of the safest options. So nothing will really happen to them. And then on your other 10 to 15% on the other side of the barbell is where you take extremely risky bets. If that side of the barbell, the speculative, the risky, the aggressive risk-taking, the asymmetric bets, if all of that goes to complete shit in its extreme worst case, totally cool, no problem, because you're relying on the other 85 or 90% side of the barbell, the majority, that's very stable. You can barbell so many things. I mean, we're not suggesting barbelling your relationship just as this bird did, but one can barbell their career, for example, which Taleb explains, I believe, in this book as well, we'll get onto. If you're trying to take a shot at extremistan, which is careers like writing, like he just explained with the writers, or I don't know, even podcasting or other careers or anything risky that's on the internet, or even a lot of the indie hacking community, right? If you want to throw all these darts where most of them are not going to stick, but once in a while one will stick, then the best way to do that is, I mean, Monish Pabrai did this himself, the investor who was a mentee of Charlie Munger. He had an extremely boring 9 to 5 in like marketing or sales in some corporation. And then he was like from 6 till 9 in the morning and then 6 p.m. until midnight every night. He basically spent something around an extra 40 hours a week just on his own business, and he would do the bare minimum at his day job to the point of not getting fired, but just getting like a satisfactory performance review, and then just completely going all in, like crushing it on his side thing to the point until it provided, he said, if it provides enough income at some point, I'll quit. If it covers if it gives me the same earning as my job. And after 9 months it did, and then he quit. Like it was like, I don't know, some IT business he'd set up or something. So that's the perfect way. So you can barbell your career, you can barbell many things. Yeah, I don't know what you want to add. There's many ways we can take this. I think this is one of the most crucial, I mean, we say that about every chapter, but one of the most crucial chapters.
It is. I mean, we can start by, I think you've given a good overview of what it is and what we've discussed previously in terms of, I think he discusses it in the Black Swan, right? Where he talks about barbell strategy to reduce the risk of ruin when it comes to being exposed to black swans. Let me read a little bit of that chapter that you've quoted in the section Seneca's Barbell, where he says, I initially used the image of the barbell to describe a dual attitude of playing it safe in some areas, robust to negative black swans, and taking a lot of small risks in others, open to positive black swans, hence achieving antifragility. That is extreme risk aversion on one side and extreme risk loving on the other, rather than just the medium or the beastly moderate risk attitude that in fact is a sucker game, because medium risks can be subject to huge measurement errors. But the barbell also results, because of its construction, in the reduction of downside risk, the elimination of the risk of ruin. So what he's essentially telling us here is, in order to achieve convexity in your chosen field, the way in which to achieve that convexity is to ensure that the risk of ruin never exists. But by design, around having no risk of ruin, you are creating a system that is either robust or that is antifragile. And in order to make it antifragile, you need to have the optionality for extreme upside, which is what the convex graph shows. And so what he's saying is, like, taking any situation and applying a barbell strategy to it probably gives you extreme capability for convexity. The interesting thing is we always talk about it in the terms of investing. We say 80% hyper conservative investing, 20% hyper aggressive investing. But actually, a quote that's probably more useful for this is Warren Buffett has said this, which is the first step, the most important rule when it comes to investing is never lose money, right? So the most important thing you can take away from the barbell strategy is make sure that your downside is capped. The second most important thing that you can take away from the barbell strategy is make sure that your upside is not capped. And I think that's what he's trying to get at with the quite complicated, I wouldn't say it's complicated, but he does go into a lot of detail in this section around what the barbell means. But the career aspect is quite interesting. And the investing aspect is quite interesting. But he does, there are other ways of thinking about barbell as well. It's not just those two.
Yes, exactly. And this is not investment advice, of course. But I've said this before in the past, but I'll give a quick overview. With investing, for example, let's say we have a lot of young listeners, reach out to us, asking for career advice, investing advice, other things. And firstly, we never give investment advice. But if you were to apply, there's different ways of applying the barbell to investing. But if you are, hypothetically speaking, again, not investment advice, if you are a young person and you have, let's say, 10 grand in savings total, and you're like, how do I grow this money? How do I grow this money? Well, 10 grand is not one of the leverage multipliers is capital, and 10 grand is not a lot of leverage. So the best thing you could do is twofold, two things you should do. Firstly, expand your skills and network and be mingling online and taking your shot at Extremistan and doing all the things that Naval talks about, leverage multipliers like code, media, etc., learning new skills, design, code, whatever, sales, etc. So expand your skill set, because as very cliche and trite, but as Buffett said something along the lines of the more you learn, the more you earn, or something like you're watering a plant and over long term you earn more as a result of your skill set. So that's the first thing I would do. Secondly, with the acknowledgement, understanding of, okay, you should be focusing on the expansion of skills and that your 10 grand capital hypothetically is not going to be a leverage multiplier, but you need to do something with it anyway. So 9 grand of that, or 8.5 grand of that, which is one side of the barbell, very safe. For example, one could put it in the MSCI World Index, which is like, I don't want to say, I've had this argument before, it was like, but if that goes to shit, then it means the world goes to shit, and that means we have even bigger worries. But that's the whole idea of black swans, like it's an idiotic thing to say, because that could happen. But, again, as I said, it's not investment advice, at your own risk. That's something. I mean, Taleb says treasury bills. If you're in the UK, accessing treasury bills may be more difficult. If you're in the US, sure. But if you're in the UK, MSCI World Index seems like something, especially with accumulation where they reinvest dividends, that's not bad as your safe side. And then the risky side, then you're like, okay, I've put, out of my 10 grand, I've put 9 into something very safe. And then what am I going to do with the other grand? Fuck knows. I'm going to YOLO it into crypto and the most speculative, degenerate BS that's just, like, as one of our friends says, parabolic. So if that one, it's with the acknowledgement that if that 1 grand goes to shit, you don't care. You don't lose sleep over it because you dedicated that to, you are willing to lose that. And that's how the venture capital model itself works, which is pension funds or large LPs who put their money into venture capital will have extremely safe investments, like 90% of their fund. And then the 10% of it, they'll be like, let's throw it at all these VCs who they may not return it. And that's fine. That's part of their barbell strategy. So all the real, the big institutional investors, pension funds, family offices, some of our LPs who are family offices, they're barbell investors themselves. And a lot of them don't realize that's what they're doing, but most professional investors do that anyway.
So let me read a passage from the same chapter, which is actually quite illuminating around what you're saying around other domains where the barbell strategy can apply. He says, more barbells, do crazy things, break furniture once in a while, like the Greeks during the later stages of a drinking symposium, and stay rational in larger decisions. Trashy gossip magazines and classics or sophisticated works, never middlebrow stuff. Talk to either undergraduate students, cab drivers and gardeners, or the highest caliber scholars, never to middling but career-conscious academics. If you dislike someone, leave him alone or eliminate him. Don't attack him verbally. And then he says something else which is quite interesting that gives another example, is another idea from Rory Sutherland. Shout out Rory Sutherland, who is friends with Taleb, I suppose, and he's also a great of marketing in the UK, but also internationally. He says, another idea from Rory Sutherland. The UK guidelines for patients with mild problems coming from alcohol are to reduce the daily consumption to under a certain number of grams of alcohol per day. But the optimal policy is to avoid alcohol 3 times a week, hence give the liver a lengthy vacation, then drink liberally the remaining 4. The mathematics behind this and other Barbell ideas are outlined with the later discussions of Jensen's inequality. So what he's referencing here is that the counterintuitive thing may actually be the most antifragile if you apply a barbell lens to it. And actually, funnily enough, he talks a lot about this, and again, we'll come onto this when we discuss the Lindy effect later on, but things that your grandma would tell you actually tend to make more mathematical sense in the context of a barbell strategy. No, don't drink for the next few days, just let your body recover. Whereas the scientist would say, or the doctor would say, no, it's fine. You can have like X, milliliters of alcohol, like saying stupid shit. Like you can have it every single day if you want, but just have a little bit. Whereas actually the optimal strategy is not to do that and take your grandma's advice. So anyway, I found that an interesting way of describing other options that exist within the barbell world.
Yeah, that kind of somewhat links in as well with the grandma Lindy wisdom as well. On the same chapter, and this is a point I'm going to quote just a couple of lines, which reminds me of friend of the show, Vizi Andrei. And we're going to throw up on the screen here. Vizi has, I think, we're active Twitter users, and I'm very selective with who I follow on Twitter because it creates your following feed. And after years of Twitter usage and being in different corners of Twitter, it's safe to say, I think, I've said this to you on the last episode, I read his tweets and I'm just nodding. I'm like, yeah, he gets it. So I would say my favorite Twitter account, to be honest. So I throw it up on the screen and his @ in the description. I recommend you follow him. Some great tweets. And this reminded me of Vizi so much because it's his style of tweeting. And so Taleb said, indeed, Georges Simenon, one of the most prolific writers of the 20th century, only wrote 60 days a year, with 300 days spent, quote unquote, doing nothing. He published more than 200 novels. And obviously this is to do with the idea of how, again, Take a Shot Naval talks about this. You sprint and you rest. We're not created for this 9-to-5 bullshit. We're not created for the same repetitive BS. As he says here, Taleb says, or if I have to work, I find it preferable and less painful to work intensely for very short hours than do nothing the rest of the time, assuming doing nothing is really doing nothing, until I recover completely and look forward to a repetition rather than being subjected to the TDM of Japanese-style, low-intensity, interminable office hours with sleep deprivation. And so this barbelling thing we're discussing, it even applies to what I just said here, how a writer, for example, a prolific writer was writing 60 days a year, the other 300 doing nothing. It's not that those 300 days you're actually doing nothing. It's the idea of, as I said, you go and ponder, or as he says, you flaneur, you just wander around and you think so much. And it's in those moments of boredom in very trite title. Ryan Holiday's book comes to mind, Stillness is the Key. But it's in those moments of stillness that you're having revelations, realizations, developing self-awareness, connecting different pieces together in your mind, which, to be honest with you, as I said, in those few years after I left the banking industry, I had so many of those moments. And then in the past year where I've gone back to corporate slavery, which is coming to an end soon, in the past year, I've honestly lost myself. Like, I haven't had pockets of time to think deeply. And I just know now that I've stepped back properly in the last few weeks, I'm like, fucking hell, I've really lost myself here. Like, you can notice, I would call it entropy of like, it's just you're degrading, you're decaying as a result of the same monotonous BS 9 to 5. You don't have time to think and pause, and you see all these 9 to 5 people. Like the first day I went through the turnstiles at work, I felt like cattle basically. Imagine the first day I'm turning up to my onboarding. I've got in, and then as I've gone through the turn, so a friend of the show who works at the company too, he said the same thing. So I go through the turnstile and there's loads of people around. I just start like, and I was just, it's like 8 a.m. You see a huge head from distance with black hair just going ha 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 hysterically to himself at like 8 a.m. And I was just laughing. I was like, fucking hell, this is literally like cattle. Like, there is no difference. Another friend of the show, Daniel Vassallo, shout out Daniel of the Small Bets community, Daniel and Louis. Daniel tweets, also has an awesome Twitter I recommend you follow. He had a tweet once that said something along the lines of, when I'm scrolling my Twitter, I don't consider it as wasting time. I consider it as, and he's a sort of, disciple and fan of Taleb, like us. He'll be coming on the show at some point. He says, it's not wasting time scrolling my Twitter feed. Once, because you've created your Twitter feed, he says, I use it as time for inspiration or to give me ideas, or you're kind of connecting things, which I totally agree with. Of course, there's a fine line as with anything, but it's the same with us. Like, this notion of switching as of episode 50, pivoting to doing books instead of interviewing insufferable founders and VCs for thousands of episodes. How did that come about? Well, it came about because of just walking around, doing nothing, thinking, scrolling Twitter, seeing what's about, what else could we do? What else is Lindy? What else is timeless? Connecting Taleb's ideas to this. You're just always connecting things. And as Daniel Vassallo says, as Vizi Andrei says, as all these guys say, even take a shot, even Naval, it's not that those 300 days you're doing nothing and you're only working for 60 days. It actually counts as you're working every day, technically, because without all those 300 days of doing nothing, you wouldn't have the 60 days of becoming the best writer with 200 best-selling whatever. So this was my favorite example that got me so excited. As you can see, it's like past 11 p.m. and I'm buzzing just talking about this. This is my favorite example of the barbell, which is, you have sprinting and then the other 80%, 85% of your time is resting, which is how we used to be anyway, evolutionarily. So
it probably has some form of biological impact on the body, whereby the increase in cortisol for that specific short period of time actually helps drive you to outcomes that are probably better in the long run and actually get the most out of you. It explains how, for example, a tennis player plays a match, right? So when you're playing tennis, your thinking is that you might be in, especially if you're playing a Grand Slam, you could be playing 5 sets, right? So you have to be able to go hard for very specific periods where it's going to be very important that you go hard, and you're going to have to chill out a little bit, if you will, and let your body recover in those interim periods. There's a very interesting story about Andre Agassi, who had figured out, I think it was Bjorn Borg or Boris Becker. He was playing one of these goats, right? And he'd figured out a tick that Becker or Borg or whoever it was had. So when they were about to serve, they'd put their tongue out on the direction that the serve was going to go. So down the tee or out wide, or, a kick serve to the body. Like, he could tell based on the tongue movement. He had to hold that information to himself and utilize it only when and where it was required, even though you'd think if you knew that, you'd just keep hammering it the right way, because it would tell, Becker that, this guy knew he was onto something. It reminds me of that as well, because it's like having to be able to play your cards close to your chest is also important in this, because if you're constantly working and putting stuff out there, there's no real time for you to cook or let marinate the things that need to be in your head and then take action upon them at the right time. So I think that's important. The other thing I'll say is, you mentioned something that I think we should take a little bit of a detour on, which is flaneuring. And this is very important in the context of, this notion you're talking about, which is like taking 300 days of the year to do nothing and then 60 days of the year to actually get your work done. Taleb's specific definition for a rational flaneur, or just flaneur, is someone who, unlike a tourist, makes a decision opportunistically at every step to revise his schedule or his destination so he can imbibe things based on new information obtained. In research and entrepreneurship, being a flaneur is called looking for optionality. It's a non-narrative approach to life. And the opposite is what he terms touristification, as he mentions, unlike a tourist. The attempt to suck randomness out of life applies to soccer mums, Washington civil servants, strategic planners, social engineers, nudge manipulators, etc. So this just made me think that actually what you're optimizing for is becoming this rational flaneur who's able to pick their time to attack, and by doing so is probably going to get a better outcome.
Yeah, I mean, that's so on brand for rationalvc.com. Let's not forget the .com. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm left speechless at times. Like, it gets me so excited. This book, these terms. It reminds me of, so like, I think Taleb may have written about this somewhere, maybe in an old Medium post, I can't remember, or a tweet. This, how, let's say you go to Rome in the summer, right? You've got hordes of tourists just on top of each other. Like, it kills and a lot of them are Americans who are I'm in Europe for 7 days. And they're wearing their New Balances and they all look the same. You can, like, if you ask any
your cap, they've got your cap and your shirt as well, by the way.
Shots fired. This is Vista Village. But yeah, this is... Yeah, they are. You can spot Americans if you ask any European, they can spot them from a mile away. And, you know, this typical American will come to Europe. Okay, Jimmy, from 9 till 11, we're going to go for a breakfast here. 11 to 1, we're going to go to see the museum. 1 to 4, we're going to go to the Coliseum. 4 to 5. And they have this itinerary non-stop, jam-packed for like a few days. And then that's it. And then Taleb's like, fuck all of that. Like, you know, the opposite of that, which is the flaneur. Flaneur doesn't even, mingle with this idea of touristification. The flaneur is in like the suburbs of Rome, where some grandmother's like hanging her laundry. Her laundry's hanging outside a house, and you're just wandering around these alleyways where people live. And then, I don't know, it just leads to serendipitous outcomes. A granny may say, oh, what are you doing here? Come to my house. I have a beautiful granddaughter you can marry, or come eat with us, or just fuck knows. Like, it just leads to interesting... So yeah, I would say like...
An interesting insight into Cyrus's thought patterns around why he'd want to not follow a plan. He might get a hot girl from a random grandmother.
I already have a hot girl, so I've secured the bag. But for the younger guys, for the 20-year-olds, I'm just... But yeah, I mean, and then you learn more about cultures, right? So if some grandmother's... Spitting game. But if some grandmother's inviting you to her house, let's say you're in a Greek island, like let's say you're in Crete or Rhodos, and then you've got a Greek grandmother, and then she invites you to her house, and you're like, whoa, you've got her 4 sons, 2 daughters, a whatever, and they're all laughing around the table. They're telling you about Rhodes. And you're like, oh, Yorios, where's the best place I can go to get food, or, to a bakery? And then he gives you all of his local recommendations, which is not this whole manipulated bullshit on Google ratings or Google Maps, where they're like the ratings are manipulated. And then you're like, the best food I've ever had overseas is always recommended by locals. It's never the 4.7 stars on Google.
These days it's all the TikTok recommendations of where to go, because
that as well.
Okay, so I think that's a good way to sort of close out the barbell strategy and flaneuring and essentially devising a way to get out of Black Swan environments and becoming anti-fragile. Let's get on to a very juicy topic that is possibly one of the most important concepts that Taleb talks about across the inserto, so much so that we have leveraged the term for our own branding. And
wow.
Exactly. I mean, it takes a lot for us to brand something.
Wow.
Much wow. But that is, drumroll please, the Lindy Effect. Now, I'll give a brief overview of what the Lindy Effect is. Maybe we, deep dive from the specific part of the book where he talks about this and starts introducing it, because if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time Taleb starts talking about Lindy.
Correct.
So my understanding of what the Lindy Effect is, before we get into Taleb's, is that it refers to, as I've written here in my many pages of notes, non-perishable things, 4 specifically non-perishable things. That which is old is likely to last longer than anything that is less old. So older things tend to last longer. Why? The longer it's been around, the more likely it is to be robust or anti-fragile. Why? Because the longer it's been around, the more it's had to deal with time. And time, as we know, is the ultimate stressor. So with time comes all the other stressors, such as uncertainty, such as randomness, whatever stressor you could think of. And so as a result, if you see anything that's super old, the likelihood of it being around for as long as it's already been around in the future is the same. So let's say something's been around for 100 years, it's probably likely to be around for another 100 years. This obviously breaks down for perishable things because that's just not the nature of those things. But it enables you to think about the world in a way which is interesting, because it provides you with a way of looking at specific actions, activities, scenarios, events, and determining, is this thing likely to be anti-fragile or not? I'll pause there.
Yes, and Taleb touches on neomania here. What is the link even here with, why are we discussing, why does he even mention Lindy in Antifragile book, like the connection? So you've touched on it a bit, and he also says antifragility implies, contrary to initial instinct, that the old is superior to the new, and much more than you think. No matter how something looks to your intellectual machinery, or how well or poorly it narrates, time will know more about its fragilities and break it down when necessary. Here, I expose a contemporary disease linked to interventionism. You remember, we discussed interventionism earlier. And it's called, this contemporary disease is called neomania, which brings fragility, but I believe may be treatable if one is patient enough. Neomania is kind of, an obsession with the new and the compulsion to seek novelty for its own sake, often at the expense of the tried and tested. You touch on something that's been around, let's say 100 years. The idea of Lindy Effect is if it's been around for 100 years, it's probably going to be around for another 100 years. And so and linking that back to our show and why it's so much to do with what we do. I mean, the description of this show is we explore a Lindy book. Every episode we explore a Lindy book and find ideas you can use in business or in life or whatever. Because when we started the podcast, the first 49 episodes, we were just interviewing hotshots. And we've said this before, but what's the point of that? Like, who's going to listen to that a year from now? Who's going to listen to that 5 years from now? Whereas if we're exploring a Lindy book, then the idea is that these episodes will largely still be relevant many, many years or decades from now, because we're discussing or exploring a book that's been around for so long. Now, the Inserto series may have not been around for so long, but these are exceptions because the ideas are timeless, I believe. These ideas, I'm very confident that the Inserto will be read more than 100 years from now. So yeah, the idea of this show is, we're going to be exploring things like, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, or we're going to be exploring Nietzsche, we're going to be exploring like Dostoevsky, and on and on and on, so many other books. And so these books have withstood the test of times. They're bound to be around another few decades at least. So this doesn't just apply to knowledge, why it's important to, as the Stoics talk about how on the shortness of life or how limited our time is, and it should be used, it should be valued a lot more. And so the information we consume should be information that's withstood the test of times. Same as, take another bloody shot, same as Naval says, talks about something. What's the quote we got on the website about relationships and compounding? Let me pull it up. Mr. Naval Ravikant says, play long-term games with long-term people. All returns in life, including relationships, come from compound interest in long-term games. And this links back to, our brand's 3 core values being authenticity, truth-seeking, and long-termism. Well, long-termism, this whole idea links back to this Lindy effect, this notion of, it adds more, richness and depth and meaning to things when something has been around for so long, whether it's your relationships, whether it's your information you're consuming, whatever it is. So, yeah, I think that's applying our lens to it in terms of its importance. So, before I get to this very extremely exciting part, I'm going to lose my mind. On this Lindy effect, he talks about, for example, and there's a diagram, there's a figure 17 we'll try and throw up, which is, if you're watching, if not, he talks about this as well himself. He says, look, cooking utensils that were used in Pompeii, who knows when, 2,000 years ago, pretty much the same as the cooking utensils used in an Italian restaurant today. It hasn't changed much. And a lot of the technology of, let's say, you're using cutlery or, silverware, a Mesopotamian technology, these kind of cement the idea of the Lindy effect more. But the part that I said severely excites me, where he sums up, still in the same chapter, and mind you, let's zoom out quickly before we zoom back in. This chapter on Lindy effect is on the time and fragility chapter, which is part of the Via Negativa book, which is book 6. So As I said, this is 7 books within Antifragile itself. We'll get onto shortly what even is Via Negativa. We said we're going to go more granular later in the episode, but we're dipping in and out. This is a reflection of Taleb's work and Taleb's mind. It's kind of connecting so many things all over the place until you get to the end and you're just like, your mind is blown. You're like, wow, okay. Zooming back in that same chapter on the Lindy Effect, he talks about how long have we had the wheels, like 6,000 years. Taleb talks about how even 30, 40 years ago, he'd be running around New York airport and you could just imagine him, this Middle Eastern guy running around the airport dressed smartly, and he's sweating buckets because he's carrying a suitcase that has no wheels. And he's like, wheels, the notion of wheels has been around for like 6,000 years or something like that. And they only put wheels on suitcases not that long ago, which kind of stopped him from sweating and running around New York airport. And he says, so we will tend to over-technologize things and underestimate the might of the equivalent of these small wheels on suitcases that will be staring at us for the next millennia. And he talks a little bit about blindness to this over-technologizing, and he started attending some of the fashionable conferences attended by pre-rich and post-rich technology people and the new category of technology intellectuals. And obviously, this links a lot with our brand and industry and network and what we've been doing at Rational VC for a few years and just generally our jobs. I was initially... because we resonate so much with all of this. Like, fucking hell, this is elite. I was initially exhilarated to see them wearing no ties. As, living among tie-wearing aberrant bankers, I developed the illusion that anyone who doesn't wear a tie was not an empty suit. So same as me, came from the banking industry, wearing your little Savile Row suit, German Street shirt, your Northamptonshire calf leather Oxfords, you're doing all that shit, and then you leave banking, you're like, to hell with this, I just want to dress in my comfortable jeans, t-shirt, sneakers. So, I'm resonating a lot with all of this, and then also with the rest of what he says to the T. But these tech conferences, while colourful and slick with the computerized images and fancy animations, felt depressing. I knew I did not belong. It was not just their additive approach to the future, failure to subtract the fragile rather than add to destiny. It was not entirely their blindness by uncompromising neomania. It took a while for me to realize the reason. A profound lack of elegance. Techno-thinkers tend to have a, quote-unquote, engineering mind, to put it less politely. They have autistic tendencies. While they don't usually wear ties, these types tend, of course, to exhibit all the textbook characteristics of nerdiness. Mostly lack of charm, interest in objects instead of persons, causing them to neglect their looks. They love precision at the expense of applicability, and they typically share an absence of literary culture. This absence of literary culture is actually a marker of future blindness, because it is usually accompanied by denigration of history, a byproduct of unconditional neomania. And he goes on and on and on, and just fight. At that point, I had to put the book down. I don't know what I did. I probably got up and started clapping, and then just went outside. But I resonate with that a lot. I mean, you and I have gone to so many of these fucking bullshit tech or VC events, and then when we leave, like, we just look at each other without even sometimes saying a word, just shaking our heads like, fucking hell.
I mean, he's not wrong. The rest of the chapter that kind of discusses what the Lindy Effect really is quite useful to read. It doesn't tell you much more than, I suppose, what we've said, apart from this distinction between non-perishable items and perishable items, and why the Lindy Effect applies to the former and not the latter. But it also discusses the concept of the Lindy Effect in terms of technology, and why neomaniacs get offended by this concept, because they could easily point to loads of counterexamples where technology hasn't been Lindy, but actually they're not looking at the reasons why that thing hasn't succeeded or carried on going, which typically tends to be, he says, could be like tax reasons or whatever. But anyway, the point is, he's talking about averages here. He's not talking about every single technology. He's talking about probabilistically derived averages, right? Which is something I think people struggle with. And he discusses some of the physicists and mathematicians that have helped him shape his understanding of what the Lindy Effect is. He talks about people like the physicist Richard Gott. He brings again to the fore Benoit Mandelbrot, who is the mathematician that he was very close to before he died, and the mathematician who he talks a lot about in the Black Swan, in particular around the issues he has with the normally distributed graph, right? So he brings out all of these things. And at the end of the book, there's also a very interesting list, which I think is quite useful for people to look at if they want to understand more about the Lindy effect, which is a list of these different authors. So he talks about Mandelbrot and how he came to the issues he had with the Gaussian curve. He talks about Gott and the Copernican idea. He talks about survival papers, and he lists a number of people you could read around survival papers, including, I think he says, Piccolotti, Arbesman, Khmaladze, etc. So he gives an overview if you want to go and do more deep reading into that subject. And I think we'll probably in the future do something that looks at the Lindy effect in a little bit more detail, given how much we kind of live by it and like the idea.
We also own the domain lindy.vc. Fun fact.
Yeah, but I can't get my head around the fact that how can venture capital be Lindy? I suppose if technology is Lindy, investing in technology should have some sort of Lindy
just
effect.
The guys who run the firm, they stand by these kind of ideas. It basically goes against everything I just read out from that paragraph about these nerdiness of which tech bros are like, yeah, I won't go into, I'm not going to pitch us even more, but which we clearly we're not like them, so, but yeah.
They're not like us. Okay. So I think we've touched enough on the Lindy effect, unless there's anything else you want to pick up on in the Lindy effect.
There was something else I wanted to say, which was, we'll throw up table 6, even though that wasn't my point. We'll throw up table 6 on the screen if you're watching, but it's just a quick, domains and comparison of life expectancy when we compare the old to the young. And the Lindy effect itself, for the perishable, every additional day in its life translates into a shorter additional life expectancy. For the non-perishable, every additional day may imply a longer life expectancy. He also touches on this chapter, preparing kids for the world, and how your kids should be reading the classics. Again, Rational VC, we explore a Lindy book. He says, new technology is easier to hype up. By the way, the last 2 books, we actually did not read from the books this much. And during the break, we were saying how, well, firstly, this is his central work, as he says himself, but this book is so dense compared to even the prior 2. And you kind of have to read some passages from it. So please excuse me, but these are the key points that I resonate with so much, and I think listeners will as well. And then we link it back to our stories. But he says, new technology is easier to hype up. I received an interesting letter from Paul Doolan from Zurich, who was wondering how we could teach children skills for the 21st century, since we do not know which skills will be needed in the 21st century. And he figured out an elegant application of the large problem that Karl Popper called the era of historicism. Effectively, my answer would be to make them read the classics. The future is in the past. Actually, there is an Arabic proverb to that effect. He who does not have a past has no future. Yeah, in an age of, I think, did you mention this? Maybe you've got it somewhere in the document. You're more familiar with his work, Jonathan Haidt. He's been discussing some of this stuff around technology use and the effects it has on children. But maybe, I guess, before you may want to touch on that is, just the importance of this. Because every day when I'm out and about, I see kids just stuck to these screens. And at least we were raised a few years without the screens before it really kicked in. These kids, their minds must be just fucking turned to mush, like this TikTok brain. I'm looking at them sometimes they're just scrolling. 3 seconds, scroll, 3 seconds, scroll, 3 seconds, scroll up. So it's like, I'd like to hear from you and what you've maybe picked up from Jonathan Haidt, but I think the importance of, as he says here, the classics are so profound. Like, limit their technology usage. You'd maybe not completely cut it out, but very little technology usage, but mainly read the classics. I don't know what you've picked up.
There's a couple of things there. In terms of reading the classics, it's difficult to create relevancy for these things, for these classic ideas and books for the current, for every new generation, because the abstractions of the ideas can be more difficult to consume. Like, it's way more difficult for someone who is born in the year 2005, let's say, to find relevancy in ideas find relevancy in ideas from old books, from Lindy books, without deep introspection and understanding. And I think that speaks to something deeper, which is you need to understand who you are as an individual first before you can actually find the nuggets of wisdom in as much depth as I think they were intended by some of the Lindy authors. Why am I saying that? Because in Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, he talks about the impact of smartphones in particular on creating fragile, essentially, children, and how that shortened attention span, the dopamine hit of searching for an answer very quickly, does two things. One, it makes you a little bit more fragile in terms of learning, so you're less able to sit and read through something. But two, it means that it takes you longer, most likely, to understand what you actually like, because you are constantly being fed an algorithm of what you should like on the basis of what the hottest new thing is that is hitting your screen and you're interacting with. And so you're constantly in this complete, neomania, what's the newest thing? And you're unable to sit and think for yourself around what are the oldest factors that would be most of use to you. When you bring all of this together, you create a system through these smartphones and these algorithms and these social media pages that from a very early age shifts the brains of young people to think in a fragile way, and then to move them from fragile to anti-fragile, as we've seen in, we've spoken about before, is very difficult to do if you have to completely rewire the way that they think. And all of this is to say that when you have a fragile generation that is unable to learn, that is unable to take away the good things from these Lindy books, you're kind of stuck in a situation which is not only fragile but negatively anti-fragile, in the fact that you keep purporting the same issues over and over again for these children and there's no way out of it. So anyway, this is where I thought this was quite interesting, and it sparked a sort of level of thought and a whole sort of spectrum of ideas around how do you actually raise a anti-fragile kid in the first place. There are simple things you can do, which is like don't take smartphones into the classroom, as like what Haidt says, or you can have kids be exposed to the Lindy ideas earlier on through, as you were talking about earlier, different methods of doing that. That's fine. Like you can probably find ways to do that. But actually, it's probably more to do with parents themselves understanding how to become anti-fragile. And then just by being around their children and spending time with their children, those concepts and notions and personality traits get pushed onto the children. So you have to set boundaries, but you also have to basically work on yourself to get yourself to the right place before you can then instill those same principles into your children. And I spoke to a friend who's recently become a dad and a couple of other people who are, parents recently. And their view was that you cannot force, particularly children, but even people like adults, you cannot force a way of thinking or specific, principles or Lindy ideas onto people. The only way those things create an anti-fragile individual is because that person has experienced the opposite and has gone through the process to learn what antifragility means. And that's probably the most difficult thing to make people realize, is because like oftentimes when you start reading Lindy shit and you get Lindy ideas from these authors, you go through this process of, this is going to change my life. This is incredible. All my friends, all you guys need to read this. And then you go down this like rabbit hole of thought and illumination. But in reality, even if you share those ideas with others, people are probably not in the right mind frame to go and learn those things and develop an anti-fragile mindset and an anti-fragile life. So the fact that it's so independent and individualistic is what also makes it so frustrating at the same time. But again, it makes it super valuable. But anyway, that was my offshoot around the anxious generation in Jonathan Haidt's book.
Firstly, I agree, because everyone's in a different headspace. So there are people older than you and I, much older, who are still probably not in the headspace to settle down and have kids. And there are people younger than us who already have kids, and it's just part of how they're wired and cultured, and their family, I guess, structure was set up that way, where you're kind of, maybe you're not told to marry young and have kids young and do this young and do that young, but it's just, it's set without, unintentionally without you knowing. So, something very important you said is, It's the idea of kids they don't listen to what you say, they watch what you do. They're literally like a sponge, and they just copy their surroundings, especially their day-to-day surroundings of parents that they're around the most. I agree that yes, maybe they're not in the headspace, or they don't have enough life experience to pick up anything from a lot of these classic books. But you think about people today like Taleb himself. The reason Taleb is Taleb, and every single line of what he says is so much signal, is because he just grew up in a home that had like a huge library, or an anti-library as we say. And so yes, maybe you're jumping from book to book, you're reading a bit of this, bit of that, a lot of fiction, but the idea is that's the whole point, right? Like if a kid is going to read Umberto Eco and the tales and these fiction books, that's the beauty of it. Like the kid gets lost in these tales, it gives them an imaginative mind. So the classics don't necessarily have to be something like as deep as Nietzsche, for example, or even Taleb's books, or Munger. He's like deferred gratification. The kids are like.
That's a really good point, because actually the best way for, in particular, children, but actually all people, adults as well, to learn is probably through fiction. I remember having this discussion with someone, I can't remember who it was, where the discussion was like, actually, do you learn more by reading non-fiction books that tell you the answer to things? Or do you learn more by reading fiction where you've got to figure out what the fuck is going on, and then introspecting on yourself, and then learning through stories? As we know from the previous episode, Narrative Fallacy, we love stories as humans. You are able to create models and ideas of how the world works better, how real world works. You're better able to see that when you read fiction. And so actually introducing children to fiction early on and having them read the greats, and that doesn't have to be Dostoevsky, because even if you're a genius, you probably struggle to understand what the fuck is going on in like the Brothers Karamazov. But anyway, the point is you're trying to create a situation where they're able to access that information in their own capacity. Do you see what I mean? And smartphones basically don't help that, which is what Jonathan Haidt is saying. But hey, you can't. That's technology is Lindy. You can't put that back into Pandora's box. So I don't really know what the answer is, but it definitely is to experience and explore yourself.
Correct. Okay, so that's the Lindy Effect. We spent a lot of time on that. People found that interesting things.
I don't even think we covered like most of what the fucking Lindy Effect is, because I genuinely think we could talk another 10 hours about the fucking Lindy. But you're right, let's just pause there.
It's the excitement of, I guess, linking it to our life, for example, things like, why this pod covers Lindy books, and we're in the headspace of in the next few years thinking about kids, and so this pod really follows our thinking a lot most of the time, to be honest. So linking it to life experiences, but I guess that's what Taleb is all about, real world risk, right? So yeah, green lumbar fallacy. You want to move on to that?
I do want to move on to the green lumbar fallacy, because it's very indicative around how our generation in particular thinks. And it's very, very fucking indicative of how people react on social media, especially when they see success. What do I mean by this? So, the fuck is the green lumbar fallacy, and why is it so interesting? My understanding, my takeaway from this was that the green lumbar fallacy is we assume that visible knowledge drives outcomes.
This is so good.
And visible knowledge drives our understanding of what success looks like. When in reality, it's the knowledge we don't see that is likely giving, some level of implication to the outcome. We love narratives. So because we love narratives, we like to think about how what we know about a certain situation would confuse us about what the answer is. So what I mean by this, if you see someone who's an entrepreneur, for example, and this is quite a good example because I think a lot of people will resonate with this. A lot of times, the entrepreneur, when you're like 60 years old, and the guy who's made the most money and is absolutely killing it in business, is very, very, very rarely the individual who is the smartest at school. Why is that important? Is because when you're at school, you're taught the Platonic ideals of what right and wrong is and how the world works, which is discussed in the Black Swan, and we discussed it in the previous episode. But that creates issues because when you hit the real world, you realize that, oh fuck, this isn't how the real world works. The person who necessarily didn't do well in school is the person because they did not do well in school, is able to deal well with the real world better. And so what you tend to do is you may see someone in the real world that did really shit at school and see them be a really good entrepreneur, and you'd be like, that's just pure luck. Or this guy had his dad that gave him a little bit of money that helped him set up his business. Or this guy was lucky and he struck gold when, whatever the fuck it is, right? But in reality, what you're not seeing is some of the reasons why that person would have done well in the first place. So another example, imagine there's a trader, right? And they trade solely Swiss bonds or something like that, right? But that trader doesn't have a fucking clue what language is spoken in Switzerland, what the capital city of Switzerland is, where the fuck it's located on a map. They can't even point it out. And you see this, and you see that person having made $100 million off a trade that's on Swiss bonds. And you go, that is just pure luck. Like, that guy obviously is an idiot. Like, he doesn't even know where the fucking Switzerland is on a map. So how could he do that? But what you're not seeing is that guy basically has the capability to, regardless of where fucking Switzerland is on a map, go and figure out what the alpha is in the trade that could make him that much money, regardless of what other information he has to bear, which is not as important. Final thing I say before I let you in is, why does this apply to social media? People will cherry pick, based on their own narrative, something around an individual to explain or to throw away the success of somebody on social media. Somebody will come on social media and say, I did this, this, and this. This is how I've become successful. And a lot of the time, if they're not providing prescriptions of how you can copy them, which we've spoken about in previous episodes as being rubbish, what you can do is look at who hates on this person and why are they hating on this person. Oh yeah, this person's successful only because, X, Y, and Z. Typically, that person is falling into the green lumber fallacy because they are unable to determine or to distinguish between the two areas of knowledge, the area that is important and the area that is not important.
I guess let's zoom out a little bit. The name green lumber comes from, exactly like you said, like let's say there's a trader who doesn't even know, trades Swiss bonds, doesn't know where Switzerland is. Because I think in the book he said the guy was like a New York Italian, and he didn't know that in Switzerland, one of the regions, they speak Italian, like Swiss Italian. So it's clueless. And so where does the name green lumber come from? It's in, let's say, in a summarized version, it involves a trader who was trading. He was a highly successful trader, trading green lumber without actually knowing what green lumber was. He thought it referred to wood painted green, whereas actually refers to freshly cut, untreated wood. And what Taleb is trying to get at here, which, as you explained, is, I guess, the idea that someone can be highly effective and successful in a complex domain without understanding the underlying details or the theoretical knowledge. The key points of the fallacy, or more so, how can one actually be one of those people? Not, maybe you want to be one of those people, maybe you just want to be aware of how can I know about something, but not just be one of these theoretical nerds that just discusses theory or thinks about theory all day, because that's one of the dangers that we try to be cognizant of or self-aware of, which is, we read all these fucking books, we discuss all this stuff, but then we always remind ourselves, just be doing shit and just be tinkering, because all this theory is bullshit. It's horse shit without any knowledge. Like, I know someone, I think you know them as well, who has a huge library. I would say an anti-library, right? This guy has a huge anti-library. He's around our age group, huge anti-library. Very successful in his job in tech for a few years. But his apologies, I take that back. He does not have a huge anti-library because he has a huge library of unread books, but they're all non-fiction, tech businessy prescriptive books. And I do not consider that an anti-library. Even if he's not read 80% of it, that's not an anti-library because it's all the same horseshit drivel in different prescriptive manner, but getting at the same thing. And so he's huge library of that kind of caliber of stuff. Read those for years, very successful in his job, decided to take a swing at the tech thing, a startup. Within 4 months, gave up and went back to a job. That example ties up to, firstly, fair play for having a go, but that example ties into so many things we've discussed today about, firstly, he got so accustomed to theory, which is fragility, and not practice, which is anti-fragility, because you get feedback and you can tinker. Secondly, the danger of a continuous stable paycheck, going back to the two Cypriot brothers, so that it really shocked him when he did the startup thing, even though he got accepted into a very good kind of tech investing accelerator type of thing. So yeah, that's the importance of, I guess, this green lumber fallacy, the foundation of it really is practical knowledge versus theoretical knowledge. And I think you can theorize all you want and talk all this horse shit, but until you, as the saying goes, get in the arena, because that's where you get feedback, and with feedback you can tinker. I think it's profound, and that's where the disconnection between knowledge and success comes, because these days the danger is on all the shitty social media apps, it's those who make the loudest noise seem perceived to be the most successful. And I tell females this who are like related to me, cousins, females within my reach who I have care for, and I want them to not only do well in life but marry very well in the future. I tell them there's a huge disconnect in your generation. You people think that whoever seems most successful online is, and I'm like, these are the exact type of people you're supposed to stay away from, because they know the least. They just are the least, bottom line, in every regard. And the people who are, to be held in high regard, on their way to be erudite in the future, people with values, ethics, morals, all the good things that, a lot of what Taleb teaches in these books. These are not people who are perceived to be the most knowledgeable. A lot of them are actually, it's all about practice. It's not theory, and they're not giving off the impression. There's no disconnection between knowledge and success. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind for your loved ones as well.
I completely agree with that. Let me just finish with a quote from the Green Lumber Fallacy part of his book, where he says, "The fact is that predicting the order flow in lumber and the usual narrative had little to do with the details one would assume from the outside are important. People who do things in the field are not subject to a set exam. They are selected in the most non-narrative manner. Nice arguments don't make much difference. Evolution does not rely on narratives, humans do. Evolution does not need a word for the colour blue. So let us call the green lumber fallacy the situation in which one mistakes a source of necessary knowledge, the greenness of lumber, for another less visible from the outside, less tractable, less narratable." Basically, I think what he's trying to get at here, and to your point around helping sort of people in your circle try to understand the difference between charlatans and not, is how do you detect bullshit? And in fact, the cleanest way to detect bullshit is to understand what someone has done versus what they say. Because even if they appear ignorant to you on the basis of what they say, if what they've done is, amazing, and they've done what you want to replicate, the reality is that completely supersedes what they say in terms of creating an anti-fragile individual. So I completely agree with you. It's just about having the bullshit glasses to be able to see through where it is bullshit and where it isn't.
I think, was it in this chapter or somewhere else in the book? Taleb, of course, takes digs at the Nobel types a lot. And he said, one of the chapters, he said how some arsehole who was on a plane, probably in business class near Taleb, kept saying to the air stewardess, I've won the Nobel. I've won this Nobel thing. And bless her, the air steward didn't actually know what this is. It's fucking got nothing to do with her. And he kept repeating it louder and louder, as if like he's trying to expect her to react with like a wow, And then Taleb just turns around just to take a look at this guy, like, who the fuck is this? And then he obviously notices who he is, and the guy just turned white, like he lost his color at the sight of. He's like, oh no, I've just seen Professor Nassim Taleb on this flight, and he's heard me trying to show off this. So it's like, these are the exact types who are just fucking fluff, like just circle jerking of theory. There's no practice. And you want to talk about practice? I mean, I don't know if we want to jump into it now or later in the episode, but like Fat Tony, you want to talk about practice? We link that back to our friend Tehran Tony, as you call him, Ali Carpet, the Iranian Fat Tony. That is as practical as you can fucking get in every regard. Like, doesn't theorize about shit, just practical. So
we can come back to Fat Tony in a bit. I think you're very right in that he can smell. There's actually a part in the book I think is like how to smell bullshit or something about Fat Tony, and how Fat Tony argues with Socrates, and how
yes
Fat Tony can figure out a sucker's game. But anyway, the concept that I want to talk about next is this point around signal versus noise, in particular around data. So a lot of people online, particularly on Twitter or X, you'll understand what I'm talking about when I talk about signal versus noise. It's said a lot, especially in the tech sphere, around what the fuck is signal versus noise. In an age where we're getting a lot more data, in an age where a lot more information is available to us at the tip of our fingertips, you would assume that that information would provide us with a lot more insights that we could take. The reality that Taleb talks about is actually it's the opposite. With more data comes more noise, and your signal is more likely to get lost in that noise. If you think about the concept of a stock, right, or if you think about the concept of your portfolio of stocks, if you check your portfolio of stocks every single day and see fluctuations on a daily basis, your natural human tendency is going to be to take away false insights, but take away insights nonetheless from those daily fluctuations that are more likely to make you want to make a decision on the basis of that information. However, if you look at the stock portfolio once every 6 months, once a year, once a quarter, whatever, and it's trending upwards, even though it dropped 20% and went up 40% in the base on, in a day or two during that period, the additional information would have told you actually probably the wrong thing, which is to get the fuck out, as opposed to staying in and just seeing consistent increases over time. Why is this important on the basis of everything else we've said? It relates to naïve interventionism. By having too much data and not being able to identify signal in all of the noise, what you essentially end up doing is breaking a cycle that could lead to an antifragile outcome. You're essentially breaking the system when and where it's actually working fine. So there is this need to understand the importance of data and information as we know it today, but with the caveat that too much data is probably harming you more so than it's doing good. And actually just not paying attention to data that much is probably less important. The final thing I'll say is in a lot of corporate jobs, in particular in consulting and investment banking, data is king, right? So a lot of insights in inverted commas, will come from additional data. If you're doing a due diligence on a company that is to be acquired for a private equity house, the private equity house will literally come themselves over how much fucking data you can provide them and information on tangential basis around all the fucking things that you could think about that would be relevant to this business model. In reality, all you really need to do as a private equity house is understand a few key basic questions when it comes to any business that you're acquiring, because all you're looking for is a fast turnaround and a flip of the business. But by over-fragilizing what data is required, you end up creating a way overcomplicated story and narrative that they then pitch to their LPs and their MDs or whatever. And you end up with an answer that is way more complicated than it needs to be and often doesn't even lead to the right outcome because you're looking at the information way too closely. If you just take a step back and say, is this going to grow at 10% a year for the next 3 years? Why? Because of X, Y, and Z. Easy, done. Let's move on. Let's invest in the next thing. That type of approach seems to have disappeared with the more data that we've got, which is actually creating a more fragile society, in particular more fragile business as we move forward.
Isn't it interesting that Charlie Munger, rest in peace, who was buying businesses for decades, there's many stories of people's interactions with him, especially when it came down to business. He's known himself for saying EBITDA equals bullshit earnings, and there's many stories of people working with him or, trying to do deals with him. He's not the type to be into all of this data that you're talking about. So, birds of a feather flock together. Mr. Munger himself operated by these, in this manner that Taleb himself talks about in being able to distinguish between signal versus noise and the dangers of too much data. So, as Munger himself said, nothing to add. You've said it all.
This one hit home for me because in reality, data is actually what's driven a lot of improvements in a lot of things, like customer service, for example, improves with further data, right? So if you can understand more about your customer as a business, the likelihood is that you can tailor the product or service better to them. Whether you do that is another issue, right? So is having too much information on the customer actually creating a disinterested customer, which often can be a good thing because it leads you to income in perpetuity, to a customer that is now, hyper conscious and involved in the decision making around whether they buy your product or service. There's a whole bunch of like second order effects that come from additional data. But the reason we bring up this point around signal versus noise and the preponderance of data today is because of the concept of via negativa or via negativa. Why is that the case? So maybe I just give a quick overview and then we kind of lead into that. As we've seen with signal versus noise, identifying causation is actually super difficult. Because systems, typically financial systems, are very, very complex, but it could be any system, we tend to struggle to find the causation behind certain events that happen, in particular Black Swan events, right? So we've discussed this on the previous pod where, people will come up with a narrative around what, the ludic fallacy, for example, around what drove an outcome, even though that thing is not the reason, it just makes sense ex post. So finding causation is hard. So therefore, if you know what not to do, oftentimes that would actually provide you more value than what to do. We'll come on to the Mungerism of this shortly and why it applies to Munger. But as a result, by understanding what the wrong thing is and removing that from the equation, that would just enable you to move more towards signal and a positive outcome. It explains, for example, focus. So it's much harder for you to remove FOMO when you're trying to work on something and only focus on the one thing and keep hammering away at the one thing. But if you know that you shouldn't focus on anything else except from the focus thing that you want to do, for example, for us is this pod, that gives you extreme power and a direction to walk in that oftentimes will leave in the positive outcome you're looking for. The final example I'll give is if you ask someone to tell you what makes them happy, you'll very rarely hear, someone say, "Oh, I know exactly what makes me happy." Right? Oftentimes you might hear things like "my children make me happy," or esoteric stuff like "relationships make me happy." That's great. But if you ask someone what makes them unhappy, they will give you so many answers and be ultra specific about it. That tells you that in order to be happy, just remove all the negative things that make you unhappy and you will be happy. I'm going to pause there. What's your views on, what do you think makes a good project manager? What's your views on via negativa?
Yeah, I have quite a bit to say on this. So, firstly, echo what you said. This whole notion of via negativa is basically less is more, right? Like you're stripping or you're subtracting rather than adding, as the name suggests, via negativa, because via positiva would be the addition. Via negativa is focusing on subtraction rather than addition. And I made I've got so many highlights here, made a ton of notes as well. You can apply this to various domains. So we've already touched on some of this, but just to reiterate, so like in health, in finance, in personal life. In health, it will be like Taleb discusses removing harmful habits such as like smoking or excessive eating, which can add a more significant impact on health than adding new supplements or routines. With finance, avoiding unnecessary risks and eliminating debt can lead to a more sort of stable financial future. And then personal life, as you say, it's more about, you want to talk about happiness. There's this whole circle jerk of happiness experts that do these podcast circuits and write these books, that you go into Waterstones.
Shots fired, bro. Shots fired.
I mean, I genuinely can't even think of names anymore because there's so many of them. Like, it's just an endless roster of, you go into Waterstones, new, best-selling, and it's like the happiness something, fuck knows. So these books are all talking about...
Do you know what's funny? I know it's
Please.
funny. I'm sorry, this is so left field, but you said something that I just thought I had to touch on. Tehran Tony, or our very own Ali Carter.
It's fucking midnight. It's talking about Tehran Tony.
When he wants to make a point, and he wants to be very, very like genuine about the point, like he's being completely like honest, right? He'll say the words. He'll say, no, genuinely. Before he says then what he wants to say. And then at the end of when he says it, he'll say, legit, right? So when Cyrus then, right now, just a minute ago, was like, all these fucking charlatans who, talk about happiness and haven't been happy for a day in their life. If you notice, he started when he said that with the words genuinely, which is it's borrowed from our good friend Tehran Tony. So just FYI, that means that he's being completely honest here. Sorry, please continue.
It's through osmosis, through, being around Tehran Tony, you pick things up. As the self-help books say, you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. But yeah, look, before you took me off track as usual, Via Negativa is around simplicity. So systems that are less complex have fewer components, therefore more robust, or if they gain from disorder, then antifragile, and less prone to failure. So by removing the elements, you reduce the potential points of failure. There's a lot. So if you want to talk about, let me pull up some stuff I have here.
Let me talk about, for a second, before you do that, let me talk about
Please.
Diets, because I have very strong opinions on diets.
Loosely held.
Nah, bruv, genuinely, these aren't loosely held, man. I can't. These are very strong ideas, strongly held.
All right, go on, because I was going to touch on elements of that, but you do it, please.
But let me start, and then
Stage
you build
is
on
yours.
it. If you go on Instagram, right? I know Instagram.
I'm not on Instagram.
Fuck off! You were on it earlier.
Yeah, I deleted it.
Oh, خیلی بد.
For the exact point you're about to make, I deleted it. But please, stage is
anyway,
yours.
if you're on Instagram, what you'll see is, even YouTube, what you'll see is probably, I'd guess, 200,000, 300,000 influencers who are all shilling one form of a diet or another. The latest one is the glucose goddess, who is anti-glucose. You have the carnivores. You have the meat-based, the plant-based. You have, who the fuck, man? You have many people that talk about diet. Vegans, whatever. What these quote-unquote dietitians, Instagram celebrities, idiots, say is that follow this very specific protocol and it will give you extreme health benefits. Oftentimes what they miss or what they don't see is more important than what they prescribe to you. By prescribing very specific and strict dietary choices for their followers, they remove a lot of the bad choices that could have been made had these followers stayed on their current diets. So let me give you an example. The carnivore diet. The carnivore diet is basically just meat, right? And no carbs, basically. And there's some forms of the carnivore diet which allow like honey and sugars and fruits and whatnot. The reason that people do well on the carnivore diet and lose weight, for example, is not because of the carnivore diet. It's because of all of the stuff that have been removed from the diet, such as bad sugars and cakes and what. Basically, by putting yourself in handcuffs around what you can eat, all the things that you have removed from the diet have a larger impact on the outcomes of the diet than what is in the diet itself. All the time, it's not even up for debate. The number one most important thing when it comes to diet is energy balance. There's this idea of calories in versus calories out, which is not quite right, but the energy balance equation is kind of that. You add stuff in like NEAT and other forms of exercise activity and whatever, and it kind of makes sense. By following these different types of protocols and diets, it's the fact that you're adhering to energy balance in a sustainable way, and you're removing the potential for eating foods that will increase your calories over time that mean that you lose weight, not because of the diet itself. So Via Negativa can also be implemented in that sense as well.
So and people will be like, why the fuck are you spending so much time discussing diets and stuff? As the saying goes in the lifting world, post physique, brah. We can throw up a photo of your physique because that's probably what you're waiting for. But there's receipts here. There's receipts.
Nah,
if you want. But anyway, the lifts are there, the strength is there, the physique's there. That's why. But we are all about holistic health as well. So we want to discuss this notion of Via Negativa applied to what you're talking about in this whole diet discussion, right? Taleb actually did make me think, because we've been in the gym for over a decade, eating, lifting, blah, blah, you a bit more so. What I take away from this is I actually, it was one of those moments I was thinking to myself, I think he mentioned like not needing multivitamins and all these supplements. And so this goes back to what you said earlier about grandmothers knowing best, or maybe Iranian parents knowing best, how since we were young, they're always just like, what are all these bullshit powders you're eating? Like, stop taking all this bullshit. Like, what is this? This is steroids. And I'm like, these are not steroids. This, like, you can get it over the counter. It's my protein. Maybe they do know best, because as Taleb talks about here, it's more about removal. Realistically, other than maybe there's this quick discussion we can have that others could benefit from, because I've been thinking about this a lot and I research stuff for many years like yourself. Other than maybe a creatine, which is well researched and proven to be very effective, I think creatine is, for the regular lifter, is probably needed and good for them, and also has cognitive benefits. But creatine aside, and okay, vitamin D for us Middle Easterns especially, other than creatine and vitamin D, maybe if you're really pushing it, then you're still moving away from Via Negativa, maybe a very high quality multivitamin. But I don't think you need anything else. Even the powders, fucking throw them in the bin. Just eat properly. I don't know what your take is on this after reading Via Negativa and this book, especially with all the shit that we've taken. Not that we've, when I say all the shit we've taken, people will be like, oh, he's taken steroids. I just relax. I just mean we've tried the whey proteins from 6 different, or probably 16 different suppliers over the years. The casein proteins, the this proteins, the brown rice proteins. It's basically all these powders of different proteins we've tried for years. So I think most of these can just be thrown in the bin. I mean, we already knew that, but it's better to just remove them and just eat more whole, nutritious food, which we knew anyway, but...
It's a hard question to answer. So in the context of antifragility, the most anti-fragile thing is to be reliant on the least number of inputs, right? Because what we know is that if you lift weights and eat enough protein, your body becomes stronger. So actually, by putting it under the stresses of a squat, the likelihood is that the stretch in the quad muscles will lead to a breakdown of your muscle fibers, which with protein will enable you to rebuild those muscles, and they'd rebuild more, even bigger. In fact, it's even better because the forces and stresses on your bones mean that, in essence, the crosshairs of your bones on the inside of your bones actually become stronger by breaking down, rebuilding and creating calluses on top of each other, which make your bones, sturdier. So we know that is how you build an anti-fragile body. The problem emerges is when marginal gains become overbearing and do not create enough value for you to be focusing on them. Vitamins is probably one, so it probably makes sense to apply the Via Negativa principle here. Don't take anything, do blood work and understand what's missing, and slowly add that vitamin or food that includes that vitamin into your diet. Oftentimes you'll find that the vitamin is probably better because it's higher in quantity of that specific. Like a tablet is probably better because it includes more of that vitamin than food would. There's debates around whether that can be absorbed in the same way, but neither here nor there, right? So Via Negativa for supplements probably makes sense. For those who are bodybuilders, I think already you're not anti-fragile anymore, right? Because your outcome, what you're trying to achieve, is completely is not anti-fragile. It's basically fragile, especially if you take drugs, right? So if you're taking drugs, you're actually taking your body from being anti-fragile to being just fragile, because as soon as you come off those drugs, your body will completely go to shit. Your muscle will degrade.
How many Gen Z bodybuilders do this, by the way, nowadays, driven by mimetic culture, Instagram bullshit. A lot of them are on gear.
To answer your question, I think it depends. But actually, if you're able to find something that works for you, and also you've got to put cost into this as well, it's quite expensive sometimes to live in, the way we eat. I eat like 250 grams of protein a day. It's not easy to live like that from a financial standpoint. So like finding what works for you is best. If that means that you're going to have a protein shake and it gives you a little bit of joy, but it's also providing you the protein necessary post-workout or whatever, fine, that's okay. I don't have an issue with it. But if you want to be truly anti-fragile, the answer is often going to be do the most with the least. And marginal gains are only going to be important if you're looking to be in the top 1%. And even then, my point is that you're probably going to be fragile, at best robust, if you're operating in the 1% of these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, Taleb talks about this himself, linking in this, what we're discussing, Via Negativa, linking it to the Lindy Effect. He says, I only have 3 drinks, water, coffee, and wine. Drinks that have been around for forever, basically, like for thousands of years or something. So same thing here. If you want to be truly anti-fragile and apply true Via Negativa, then you would just pretty much do the same. And then also you mentioned a lot of bodybuilding is fragile, which is correct, because Taleb also discusses the notion of it's muscle without strength, and one needs both. In addition to those, even more important than all of this, he talks about, which a lot of why I nod and go crazy at this book is, as he says himself, a great book says kind of things that you kind of feel or have been thinking, but you haven't been able to articulate yet or really get down on paper, which he talks about the importance of street smarts and especially street fighting. Because he says, what's the point of all this? Like, these bros go to the gym, they pump up their muscles, like trying to look like Arnold 6 days a week, 7 days a week, measuring to the milligram, the perfection on the little scale with their brown rice and all this bullshit broccoli. And he's like, yeah, but one punch, bam, and you're just fucked. Like, if you look at a physique of a UFC fighter, okay, let's not talk about top 50 in the world. Let's just take a regular UFC fighter who will still absolutely fuck you up. Like a rank 200th UFC fighter in the world, for example. And you look at a lot of their physiques. I sent you a photo the other day, this tweet analysis. They actually have fairly wide waists, not huge waists, but fairly wide. They don't look like bodybuilders. It's not, if you want to talk about like, are they going to get on stage like Arnold, tanned and oiled up and pose their physiques? No, they're far off looking anything like that. They're not going to look like any statues, but they'll absolutely fuck that guy up. So it's a question of, okay, that makes you, in the event of a Black Swan, and obviously nowadays it's not so much of a Black Swan if you get attacked in London, but it used to be. But in the event of you getting attacked, or you want to be able to protect your family in the future, you need to be able to just protect yourself, like protect you and your family and those around you. And I've tweeted this before, but I said my advice to very young guys, because they always come to us for advice, blah, 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 is do 3 things. And I think I can remember like 2 of them, which I wrote in this tweet, which is it was 3 things. Yeah, I remember. It was go martial arts, go start lifting, and go to Toastmasters, which learn how to speak basically properly. If I were to only pick one, it would be the fighting. If I'd only pick 2, it would be fighting and Toastmasters, and then gym would be 3rd on that list. Like, they're all important, but what is the point of muscle without strength? What is the point of muscle and strength without the ability to just KO someone or self-defense? So
the other thing is that muscle is fragile in the sense that you will experience a degradation of your muscle as you age, and you cannot build that back to the extent that you would have had when you were younger. So by its very nature, it is fragile as well, unless it serves a purpose, which is to be able to walk, to be able to squat, to be able to raise your grandkids with your arms, like that type of stuff, which actually has a reason behind it, which makes it important. Yes. Okay, anything else on Via Negativa we want to talk about?
Couple of things just to wrap it up. I mentioned earlier the importance of like go and expand your skill set, for example, because if you have a multidisciplinary skill set and background in times of disorder, you could potentially gain from that and be anti-fragile. And in the Via Negativa chapter, Taleb talks about, quoting further, being fooled by randomness is that, in most circumstances fraught with a high degree of randomness, one cannot really tell if a successful person has skills, or if a person with skills will succeed. But we can pretty much predict the negative, that a person totally devoid of skills will eventually fail. And on the importance of why one should have skills. And also, this is what I wanted to discuss. Very, very important. This is when the Iranian comes out, you know. I've got a point to make. You discussed this happiness point, and this is what I was talking about, and you cut me off, you were trolling me. I was explaining how a lot of these happiness circle jerk authors with their self-help books about happiness go around. And then you mentioned how I say genuinely legit, so I really have a point to make. So I do have a point to make. The point I was trying to get at is, fucking hell, you make me forget all of these key golden nuggets.
Cyrus likes to blame me for his lack of ability to remember things. So
my poor.
Think of that what you will.
Yeah, right. So this happiness point. He discusses the...
You'd think that he could remember a lot with that massive head of his, but apparently not. Sorry, continue.
As they say, it's an encyclopedia up here, so there's a lot to... I'm trying to... Row 8, Department 16, all right. Anyway. Fucking hell, it's too much, Robert. Give me a second. Let me fill up this happiness point. I'm trying to recall at 1 a.m. when it's in front of me. Chucks. Okay, there's links in the decision making as well. But the point around happiness that you raise is extremely important, because all these authors go around being happiness experts nowadays. But real happiness comes from, it links in, removal of things, which is Via Negativa, but links in with Munger's notion of reverse something on its head, which I believe he got from Jacobi. I'm trying to recall. Forget where Munger got it from because I can't recall right now. But Munger himself says inverse, always inverse. So, for example, I want to have a great marriage and a great family with many happy, proper raised kids, everything. A great family life I want to have. Munger says rather than striving for something like this, why don't you flip it on its head? Why don't you inverse it? What would it look like for me to have a very bad marriage, very bad kids, very bad family life? Okay, write all of those down. And then you say, okay, now how do I avoid all of those things? How do I avoid getting there? This is pretty much also a lot of what Via Negativa is, if you look at it this way. So this has actually been a lot of how I've been thinking about things or applying things more so recently, in recent years and recent months, without even realizing in many cases. So especially even you think about like, okay, I'm thinking about, okay, long-term life partner selection. That's how I flipped it on its head without even realizing, to be honest, because the aim is, and Taleb talks so much about in this book of, we're always applying optionality in our lives without realizing. And I realized how much of what I optimize for, not maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, but definitely in recent years and recent months, is in many cases without realizing, some cases intentionally, this whole Via Negativa, flip it on its head, Munger style inversion. How, for example, how will I know what would a great marriage look like? Okay, what would a bad marriage look like? Flip it on its head. Okay, this person I'm dating, I'm seeing, will they fulfill that? Okay, maybe not. So, or yes, they will. And then you know, like, okay. And you can apply that to many other areas or elements of life. So I think happiness experts have it wrong. Don't read those horseshit books. That was basically why I got riled up earlier. Just flip it on its head. Just do Munger style. As he says, take a simple idea and take it seriously. And as everyone asks him every single annual meeting for like 50 years, Munger, Buffett, why don't more people copy you? And as they say, common sense is uncommon because it's too easy. That's why no one copies them. So
I think what you've said flows really well into the last area that we want to talk about, the last concept we want to talk about before deep diving into the rest of the book.
4 hours and 20 minutes.
So I think the last bucket is on the ethics of antifragility or fragility. And what you said about happiness is really interesting. So a lot of people, when it comes to happiness, will say, a lot of researchers on happiness would even say, in earning anything more than $70,000 a year, £70,000 a year will make you unhappy. But the problem is they make more than $70,000 a year. So the likelihood is that they're not even taking into consideration their own recommendations. Why is this important? Because they have no skin in the game. And this is where the ethics of antifragility begin to create a storyline that feeds into his next book, which is called Skin in the Game. There's 2 rules for skin in the game. The first is never get on a plane if the pilot is not on board. And the second rule is make sure there is also a co-pilot. Again, this could apply to don't ask people what they think or for a recommendation or their opinion. Just look at what they've done. And this actually spurred a thought for me, which is, I don't know where I saw this, but I definitely saw it somewhere, either on Twitter or on a podcast, where people often want to ask someone to be their mentor. People will often email, someone they really admire and say, can you be my mentor? Whereas in reality, what you could have just done is have multiple unofficial mentors. And what that means is you could have just looked at what they did in their lives, read up on them, understood what that led to, and how they maneuvered the different things that happen in their life. If you take that, you would have learned a lot more than having that person be a pseudo-therapist to you whenever you have an issue.
Yeah, I mean, Taleb talks himself about if you're going to go to someone and just say, can you be my mentor? That never ever works out. He doesn't say that. I'm saying that because it's common sense, and yet people still do it. And the best advice comes from, you're just adding value for someone, or you're just reaching out to them. We know many young guys who reached out to us. They haven't asked, can you be my mentor? They just ask advice on something and we reply. And then they go and do something, they come back with the results. We're like, whoa, that guy responds well. He asks another thing, so then we help more. And then you've just formed a mentee-mentor relationship without realizing or without any intention. What do I have to say about this chapter? Well, These ideas expand in the Skin in the Game book, which is our next episode. But here, Taleb does introduce skin in the game. On the ethics point, he talks about at some point fitting ethics to a profession and wealth without independence. And you touched on the treadmill effect, which is a brilliant point Taleb makes. And there is a phenomenon called the treadmill effect, similar to what we saw with neomania. You need to make more and more to stay in the same place. Greed is anti-fragile, though not its victims. Back to the sucker problem in believing that wealth makes people more independent. And he essentially concludes this whole section with, you cannot possibly trust someone on a treadmill. And we're fitting ethics to a profession, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about someone whose profession carries no skin in the game versus someone who does. And talking from personal experience, the people who are the slimiest, the sleaziest, no backbone charlatans have always been those in, let's say, in corporations, like when I was in banking or any corporate environment I've worked in, which are basically all no skin in the game environments, even in tech. The type of people who, exactly as he says here, you cannot possibly trust someone on a treadmill. These are the same people who you just know it's all fake. Like, years after you leave, no one really keeps in touch. It's all total horseshit. It's all total, complete horseshit. Whereas someone who has complete skin in the game, let's go back to Tehran Tony, our dear friend Ali Carpet. I met him in university, and again, just a quick recap, you can listen on the previous episode. We dive into his background, why he's called Ali Carpet, or as Iman now calls him, Tehran Tony, which is a great name, the Iranian Fat Tony. You can listen on the last episode, his story. You know, this is the type of person who since uni has not only kept in touch with me, we formed a very strong friendship. He's one of my closest friends now. But in times of, I mean, you remember this speech I gave at his wedding, which was genuinely heartfelt, because he lives by, without even maybe realizing, but he lives by a lot of those stoic virtues and values of the old Stoics. And his kindness and empathy and what he's done for me and what I see he does for many other people in the past. Why is that? Why is he a person like that? Well, of course, you have, you could say it's to do with his upbringing, his values, all of that, which absolutely it is. But I think a large part of his ethics is from not only what I've seen in him, but other people with a skin in the game have always been people that I can, trust on. It doesn't mean people with no skin in the game I cannot trust, because you and I both have had no skin in the game for many years. I've had pockets of it, but this past year I haven't. Many years in corporate I didn't have skin in the game. So it doesn't mean that you can't trust people, but that's different. You and I and our friend WhosAria, this is like a 25 plus year compounding friendship. That aside, if you're trying to form new friendships, I would say this is a huge indicator or a green or red flag, is whether that person has skin in the game or not, or the ethics of their profession. So are they, I believe, have a friend close to you who's like a surgeon or a doctor? Well, if he's operating and he fucks up, then he kills someone. That's skin in the game. Same with Ali Carpet, So I think that's a huge point. It's we can go on all day, but I think using those life examples kind of makes it pretty clear. Kind of links back to how you do one thing is how you do everything. Quite trite, but
I suggest we now take a break, and we will come back and do a deep dive into each chapter for you autistic nerds that want to understand this book in even more detail. Okay, and we're back from our short break. What we're going to do now is we're going to go a little bit deeper into the book by sort of starting with quotes from the book that we really like, and then discuss what that means in the context of the concepts in the book, but also our experiences and what we have learnt in life that reflect why we like these specific quotes. So if I start, the first one, which I really want to talk about, and I know is something that you really, really like, is the quote that starts, "Modernity has replaced ethics with legalese, and the law can be gamed with a good lawyer. So I will expose the transfer of fragility, or rather the theft of antifragility, by people arbitraging, in inverted commas, the system. These people will be named by name. Poets and painters are free, and there are severe moral imperatives that come with such freedom. First ethical rule, if you see a fraud, and do not say fraud, you are a fraud.
Cheers to that with my Iranian tea.
Just as being nice to the arrogant is no better than being arrogant towards the nice, being accommodating towards anyone committing a nefarious action condones it. Tell me why you like this quote.
We're like 3 or 4 hours in. I don't know how the fuck we haven't even mentioned that one yet. It's too good. Why I like that quote, that's... So, as I said, the Rational brand, over 4 years ago, since inception, was founded on the teachings and philosophies of the Incerto series and Poor Charlie's Almanac. And as the name suggests, because obviously Rational VC, but also a Rational VC is in itself an oxymoron. It's a bit of an FU to the industry. The first essay I wrote 4 years ago, whenever it was, on all of these topics, or over 4 years ago now, was really calling out a lot of the BS in the VC and tech industry. And why? Well, it's genuinely my internal... I have so much internal friction, I'd probably have a seizure if I don't get it out. If I see fraud and I do not say fraud, it's again, like Taleb said, the best books are those that are just, they're speaking for you without you even realizing. Like, it's what you've been thinking or feeling, or without even being able to articulate or consciously put down. So I don't know if it's a Iranian immigrant internal thing, a Middle Eastern immigrant similar to Taleb, where, you know, your country's faced turmoil and bullshit and you've had to leave it behind. And you have I wouldn't call it a short fuse. I'd call it more of a bullshit detector. You have no time for BS. And this is probably where this whole fanaticism with authenticity comes in and why it's so important, but also from an ethical standpoint, more importantly, and skin in the game. And I don't want to sound like a charity here, but as they say, real ones, maybe because real ones have care and empathy for society, for those around them, and ethics are important, whether they realize it or not. Yeah, it's crucial to me. It underpins a lot of our brand. Like, if you see fraud, do not say fraud. And then you have the, as Taleb called David Sachs, a techno watermelon, we've said before, you know, David Sachs types in Silicon Valley, like, you can be right, I can be rich. And I'm like, well, there's a way of doing both as well. You know, you can be right and you can be rich, and it's not good to be a fraud, like many people in Silicon Valley. And I think we haven't even seen a lot of the scams being exposed yet in Silicon Valley. We've only scratched the surface. In the next few decades, we're going to hear some crazy stories about how a lot of the structural, it's basically been a Ponzi scheme, much of it. So
the very interesting thing about this quote is that he goes on to say, further, many writers and scholars speak in private, say, after a whole bottle of wine, differently from the way they do in print. Their writing is certifiably fake, and many of the problems of society come from the argument, in inverted commas, other people are doing it. So if I call someone dangerous, ethically challenged fragilista in private after a third glass of Lebanese wine, white, I will be obliged to do so here. A couple of things. The reason I love this quote, if you see a fraud and do not say fraud, you are a fraud, is because it identifies who is a fake, a phony, who is the fragilista that Fat Tony can sniff out in a second, and who is not. And the place where this becomes ultra evident is Taleb on Twitter or X. Taleb is famous for going on tirades against certain individuals like the techno watermelon David Sachs, as he calls him. And look, I have nothing against David Sachs. I think he can be pretty intelligent, and the guy's a brilliant investor in certain sense around software investing at the early stage, right? So the guy is impressive in and of himself. But Taleb goes after certain individuals that he feels are fake, so they don't stick to their own word. And he does so in a way to hold himself to account so that he doesn't see himself as a fake. He invokes the spirit of, across all of his books, he invokes the spirit of a lot of the classicists. And in particular, he invokes the spirit of two, Seneca the Younger, who says, he who is brave is free. And he also invokes the spirit of Thucydides, who says, the secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage. Taleb talks about this in the context of, speaking against apartheid or, different political activities that are unfortunately happening in the world. And he tweets something along the lines of, I am tired of people who say that I can voice my opinion because I am free. I am free because I never hid my opinion, no matter the cost. If you see something happening that is antithetical to what you truly believe and you don't speak about it, you are the issue at hand. You are causing that issue to blow up. Final thing I'll say. We haven't discussed the concept of a fragilista yet, and he talks about it a lot. It's one of these words that he's kind of termed, but he says specifically the fragilista belongs to that category of persons who are usually in suit and tie, often on Fridays. He faces your jokes with icy solemnity and tends to develop back problems early in life from sitting at a desk, riding airplanes, and studying newspapers. He is often involved in a strange ritual, something commonly called a meeting. He goes on to describe more about what the fragilista is, and more about like the issues that come from the uber fragilista as well. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, by him creating this kind of dichotomy between what is right and what is wrong in his own head, and then performing that publicly, he holds himself to account. And the fragilista doesn't do that. And someone like a Fat Tony or a Tehran Tony, Mr. Ali Carpet himself, will be able to sniff out that fake motherfucker in a second, and for better or for worse, be able to live a different life by avoiding those types of individuals.
The whole fraud point, if you see fraud, do not say fraud, and everything you articulated it's like you've said everything that I'm not able to even articulate myself. Yeah, perfectly put, basically. I'm just enjoying it. I want to touch on, in the Via Negativa book, end of chapter 19, Taleb discusses about decision making. I discovered that I had been intuitively using the less is more idea, so Via Negativa, as an aid in decision making, contrary to the method of putting a series of pros and cons side by side on a computer screen, which I think many of us are guilty of doing in the past. For instance, if you have more than one reason to do something, choose a doctor or a vet, hire a gardener or an employee, marry a person, go on a trip, just don't do it. It does not mean that one reason is better than two, just that by invoking more than one reason, you are trying to convince yourself to do something. Obvious decisions, robust to error, require no more than a single reason. And I think that's a very, that was, again, one of those parts of the book where I just had to put the book down and go and think a little bit.
He says something further on, which is even better, doesn't he? Which he says,
please.
If someone attacks a book or idea using more than one argument, you know it is not real. Nobody says he is a criminal, he killed many people, and he also had bad table manners and bad breath and is a very poor driver. It speaks to a lot of the issues we see in society today, but in particular emanating from the echo chambers of social media, where people that overdo it tend to actually get rewarded by the algorithm, thereby blowing up their name even more online, but actually detracting from the whole point of you going, raising that point in the first place. And it's interesting that he says he discovered it intuitively, because I feel like a lot of the stuff that Taleb speaks about or writes about or researches about, does fucking complex statistical mathematics about, is often like stuff that he either knows innately to be true, like something his grandmother told him, and him exploring why that is the case, or him just playing around and flaneuring in life and then it coming to him, and then him being able to like prove it mathematically.
Yeah, and the end of that, chunky paragraph or chapter further on, he says, so a heuristic, if someone has a long bio, I skip him. At a conference, a friend invited me to have lunch with an overachieving hotshot whose resume, quote unquote, can cover more than two or three lives. I skipped to sit at a table with the trainees and stage engineers. This is brilliant, because I resonate with this when I was in banking. I remember you go to like these black tie events and bullshit events and whatever, and the table with all the bankers is just insufferable. And I would love to sit with like the lads from the back office who just want to down pints of Guinness and then just shoot the shit, basically. They're not pretentious. They're not showing off about, I went to my Etonian Oxbridge Circle Jerk, and they have literally nothing interesting to add. So brilliant. I really like that one.
This point around, sorry, just one last thing. This point around the singular being more important than someone invoking multiple reasons. In footnote 2 on that specific page, he also says, even the Nobel Prize, with all its ills of inducing competition in something as holy as science, is not granted for a collection of papers, but rarely for more than a single but major contribution. It's like, even the best things are awarded to those that come up with the single notion of truth or reality.
Exactly. Still on the Via Negativa book. Again, we're discussing things about today that our headspace is in. So we're thinking about happiness and marriage, for example, again. So we come back to that. We're on Via Negativa. And Taleb says, we've touched on this before, but giving his thoughts now. Likewise, happiness is best dealt with as a negative concept. The same non-linearity applies, as I mentioned earlier. Modern happiness researchers, who usually look quite unhappy, do not use non-linearities and convexity effects when they lecture us about happiness, as if they knew what it was and whether that's what we should be after. Instead, they should be lecturing us about unhappiness. So exactly to the point that I was making earlier.
I derive the rule that what is called quote-unquote healthy is generally unhealthy, just as quote-unquote social networks are antisocial and the quote-unquote knowledge-based economy is typically ignorant. I find that funny because he's basically just sending for everyone.
I have one here, which is, I really resonate with this one. It's still in the, I think the Via Negativa book is so strong. This is still in the same Via Negativa book. In the section, or to live long but not too long. If you recall, I have a tweet. I'm going to paraphrase it, but I can throw it up on the screen for those listening and link it in the show notes. You don't need to go backpacking 2 years to find yourself and all this bullshit. You just need to do 5 or 6, a few simple things. I mean, the first one is become the best version of yourself in every capacity, whether it's intellectual, knowledge, physical strength, spiritual, yada, yada, yada. You become the best version of yourself. Number 2, you obtain independence or freedom or FU money, as Taleb talks about. This doesn't mean multi-millions. It just means enough where you're free. And then number 3 was procreate and have as many kids as you financially and possibly can, and pass on all the great things, qualities that you learned in point 1. The other one was like help others and, just pass on your knowledge and wisdom, like something to do with life's work or something. So you're like, as Kevin Kelly says, the reward for good work is more work. So you're really leaving behind wisdom, children, and you live a free life and you aim to become an erudite. So it's like a summary of what my tweet said. And so Taleb now, I was losing my mind when I read this, at the end of the to live long but not too long chapter, he says, so he's talking about people who want to live forever, right? They have this notion of, and this has become more of a trend, especially recently, how fitting in the Silicon Valley world, as we say. It's a lot of focus on individualism, and rather than Taleb is talking about, all I hear is how to live longer, richer, and of course with more electronic gadgets, yada yada. But for the ancients, the worst possible outcome was not death, but a dishonorable death, or even just a regular one. For a classical hero, dying in a retirement home with a rude nurse and a network of tubes coming into and out of your nose would not be the attractive telos for a life. Goes on and on. It talks about the idea of me, in air quotes, as a unit can be traced to the Enlightenment, and with it fragility. Before that, we were part of the present collective and future progeny. Both present and the future tribes exploited the fragility of individuals to strengthen themselves. Sadly, as I am writing these lines, the economic system is loading future generations with public debts, causing depletion of resources and environmental blight to satisfy the requirements of the security analysts and the banking establishment. As I wrote in chapter 4, while the gene is antifragile since it is information, the carrier of the gene is fragile and needs to be so for the gene to get stronger. I'm going on, but I'm getting to the point because this is so profound. It talks about, he was reading John Gray's The Immortalization Commission about attempts to use science in a post-religious world to achieve immortality. And after reading this, Taleb says, I felt some deep disgust, as would any ancient, at the words of the singularity thinkers, in air quotes. It is not just neomania. While I propose removing offensive elements from people's diets and lives, he works by popping close to 200 pills daily. This reminds me of Brian Johnson and the likes of the longevity scientists in Silicon Valley nowadays. Beyond that, these attempts at immortality leave me with deep moral revulsion. It's funny, Taleb's writing this, 10, 15 years ago, yet now we're seeing even more of this, right? So within our space in Silicon Valley. He goes on to say, we're getting to the best part now. Everything I said leads to this. It is the same kind of deep internal disgust that takes hold of me when I see a rich 82-year-old man surrounded with babes, in air quotes, 20-something mistresses, often Russian or Ukrainian. I am not here to live forever as a sick animal. Recall that antifragility of a system comes from the mortality of its components, and I am part of that larger population called humans. I am here to die a heroic death for the sake of the collective, to produce offspring and prepare them for life and provide for them, or eventually books, my information, that is, my genes, the antifragile in me, should be the ones seeking immortality, not me. Fucking hell, like the tweet I wrote before I'd even properly read this, I wrote that tweet a while back, talking about, to me, what is like the meaning of life. And then here he goes and says this, which I see quite a lot of parallels and similarities. So yeah, but of course he puts it in much, he words it a lot better, and the message hits home. So I think that's a good reminder for all of us.
I like that. And there's another part, I think in chapter 3, where he talks about this in a similar fashion, I think. But he says, there exists the kind of people for whom life is some kind of project, which I think references what you're talking about as well. After talking to them, you stop feeling good for a few hours. Life starts tasting like food cooked without salt. I, a thrill-seeking human, have a bullshit detector that seems to match my boredom detector, as if we were equipped with a naturalistic filter, dullness aversion. Ancestral life had no homework, no boss, no civil servants, no academic grades, no conversation with the dean, no consultation with an MBA, no table of procedure, no application form, no trip to New Jersey, no grammatical stickler, no conversation with someone boring you. All life was random stimuli, and nothing good or bad ever felt like work. Dangerous, yes, but boring never. Finally, an environment with variability, hence randomness, does not expose us to chronic stress injury, unlike human design systems. If you walk on uneven, not man-made terrain, no two steps will ever be identical. Compare that to the randomness-free gym machine offering the exact opposite, forcing you into endless repetitions of the very same movement. Much of modern life is preventable chronic stress injury. And I think that basically puts into a nutshell what it is that you're saying, is that life can't actually be valuable unless you do some of the things that you said in your tweet, but also if you make it monotonous. And the problem with modernity is that it optimizes for monotony, so that you have no variability, so that everything is understandable and known, but that essentially takes away what is good about life. And I think he does a very good job in this book of making you realize that being anti-fragile actually comes with so many benefits, and living in a world of randomness comes with so many benefits, that we've tried to strip away by creating a modern lifestyle.
Fucking poetry. So exactly to that point, because in people who are stuck in this fragilistas, as you say, or as he says, in this 9 to 5, in this daily grind, and doing all the things that you just, from the quotes you read out, this monotonous lifestyle, after a long time, especially after a decade plus, after 10, 15, 20 years of living like that, they completely lose themselves without realizing, because it becomes the norm. And that's the whole, obviously, part of the notion of the treadmill effect. But people talk about golden handcuffs, whatever type of handcuffs you want to call it, but I've seen it happen to people where you probably know this from your consulting days, but people who would retire within a few years, some of them would actually die or pass away because they would decay, because the only mental stimulation that they know and that they're accustomed to is that corporate world. And I don't know, it's the human brain is fascinating. There's a lot of stuff that will probably come out about this in the next few 100 years, about how these last few decades, and especially this corporate era, how it rewired people's brains, people who stayed there for so long, that it completely removed this. When you zoom out in the grand scheme of things, how many for millennia, we've had variability in our day-to-day lives. And in this short period of time, it's this monotonous nature of it becomes so ingrained in the way people think and apply it to everything in life. And then they just die. And then obviously, as I say, we're nothing but a fart in the wind in the cosmos of time, completely forgotten. But that aside, they, in this extremely rare, like, positive Black Swan event of being born and living in the Western world and being English speakers and all the other benefits, not trying to take some risks or at least barbell things or yada yada yada, but becoming, and some of them I don't blame, because for whatever reason they were never exposed to such ideas. They had debt to pay after university and then get married, have kids, and then other stresses. Like, they don't get a fucking second to breathe, which goes back to what a lot of Vizi Andrei and Daniel Vassallo talk about, boredom. But I do hope for anyone listening, especially for us, this has been a huge reminder, wake-up call, slap in the face of, like, I mean, like the Stoics talk about the shortness of life. A third of the life has gone, which is really your eating, shitting, sleeping, going to school, and just finding your feet in your career, or career, whatever you want to call it, professional world. The last third, you're going to be old. It's the period of giving back, helping others, and hopefully grandchildren and stuff like that. So the only real third of, like, real execution and action and enjoying yourself for all of the things you touched on is the third that's just starting now. And it's so fucking short. If you see how fast our time's gone so far, I echo all of that. And I think it's a good reminder of, if you're going to apply all this fucking via Negativa stuff, need to be... Basically, we need to go hard on rational trucks. Because that
He says as we're 5 hours into recording a podcast. Dude, we're going hard.
I have another one which I literally wrote in my sticky note. Wow. True wealth. Let's literally look. He talks about fucking hell, this Via Negativa book. Still in the Via Negativa book. I can see why Daniel Vassallo quotes a lot of Via Negativa stuff on Twitter, actually. I think it's one of his favorite books. He'll be coming on the show. In Via Negativa, in the To Live Long But Not Too Long chapter, same chapter, the iatrogenics of money section, he talks about, to understand the outright denial of antifragility in the way we seek wealth, consider the construction laborers seem happier with a ham and cheese baguette than businessmen with a Michelin 3-star meal. Food tastes so much better after exertion. And he goes on and on about the Romans and stuff. But the following page, but just imagine how, by the subtractive perspective, via Negativa, we can be better off by getting tougher. No sunscreen, no sunglasses if you have brown eyes, no air conditioning, no orange juice, just water, no smooth services, and I think you touched on some of this stuff, no soft drinks, no complicated pills, no loud music, no elevator, no juicer, no... I stop, he says.
There's a part in the book which I really like. It's quite early on, where he talks about traditional cultures as well, which I find to be quite relevant to us, given we were raised in relatively traditional households. He says the unit in traditional cultures is the collective, and it could be perceived to be harmed by the behavior of an individual. The honor of the family is sullied when, say, a daughter becomes pregnant, or a member of the family engages in large-scale financial swindles and Ponzi schemes, or worst, may even teach a college course in the charlatanic subject of financial economics. And he then goes on to describe the mafia. So he says, in the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia, the designation man of honor, or uomo d'onore, implies that the person caught by the police would remain silent and not rat on his friends, regardless of benefits, and that life in prison is preferable to a plea that entails hurting other members. The tribe, Cosa Nostra, comes before the individual, and what broke the back of mafia was the recent generation of plea bargainers. I love this because basically, you know how earlier you were saying he'll find things that make sense to us, but we can't really come up with a legalese or rational reasoning as to why those things make sense. He then provides the sense making, and it makes everything click for you.
I mean, people say why the obsession with Taleb and Munger, or more so, especially the Inserto and Paula Charlie's Almanac. That's pretty much it, what you just said at the end there, because they make sense of, they connect the pieces that deep down we feel, but we haven't yet connected or articulated, or so on. I want to touch on Fat Tony debates Socrates. We have our own Tehran Tony, chapter 17. I'm not going to read the discussion of this, hypothetical debate that Taleb has created between Fat Tony and Socrates, because of course they lived in different time periods. But to prove his point, he kind of shows a little debate between Fat Tony and Socrates, at which Fat Tony essentially wins this argument. But the reason he wins is because of his, the point it's getting at is instinct, which is what you're getting at and what you just discussed. Things we know but cannot express. And that is exactly what, as you just said, exactly why we resonate with so much of what Taleb writes in the same chapter. Moving on, I mean, if people want to read the debate between Fat Tony and Socrates, you can pull it up in the book, or I'm sure it's somewhere online summarized. But in that chapter, there is a section called the sucker-non-sucker distinction. Taleb says, this is again a very key idea that's being repeated or brought up here. Taleb says, let us introduce the philosopher's stone back into this conversation. Socrates is about knowledge, not Fat Tony, who has no idea what it is. For Tony, the distinction in life isn't true or false, but rather sucker or non-sucker. Things are always simpler with him. In real life, as we saw with the ideas of Seneca and the bets of Thales, exposure is more important than knowledge. Decision effects supersede logic. Textbook, air quote, knowledge misses a dimension, the hidden asymmetry of benefits, just like the notion of average. The need to focus on the payoff from your actions instead of studying the structure of the world or understanding the true and the false, in air quotes, has been largely missed in intellectual history. Horribly missed. The payoff, what happens to you, the benefits or harm from it, is always the most important thing, not the event itself. He wraps up here with, philosophers talk about truth and falsehood. People in life talk about payoff, exposure and consequences, risks and rewards. Hence, fragility and antifragility. And sometimes philosophers and thinkers and those who study conflate truth with risks and rewards. And truth here with a capital T, of course. So, yeah, that's a key part. Again, we want to link it with practice versus theory. We want to talk about here Fat Tony, sucker versus non-sucker, and the importance of whether you want to sit there and philosophize talking versus actually doing and focusing on payoff, risk, and exposure. So I think that was a crucial part.
That is a crucial part. But there's an example he gives earlier on in the book about Fat Tony that brings this to life. So he says, it's in a section called How Fat Tony Got Rich and Fat. He says, Fat Tony got to become literally Fat Tony, rich and heavier in the aftermath of the Kuwait War. The sequence was conventional, that is, first rich, then fat. It was in January 1991, on the day the US attacked Baghdad to restitute Kuwait, which Iraq had invaded. Every intelligent person in socioeconomics had his theory, probabilities, scenarios, and all that, except Fat Tony. He didn't know where Iraq was, whether it was a province in Morocco or some emirate with spicy food east of Pakistan. He didn't know the food, so the place did not exist for him. All he knew is that suckers exist. If you asked any intelligent analyst or journalist at the time, he would have predicted a rise in the price of oil in the event of war. But that causal link was precisely what Tony could not take for granted, so he bet against it. They are all prepared for a rise in oil from war, so the price must have adjusted to it. War could cause a rise in oil prices, but not scheduled war, since prices adjust to expectations. It has to be in the price, he said. Indeed, on the news of war, oil collapsed from around $39 a barrel to almost half that value, and Tony turned his investment of $300,000 into $18 million. There are so few occasions in one's life, you can't miss them. So here's why Fat Tony is brilliant, is because Fat Tony is literally the midwit meme. You know how we joke about the midwit meme? And look, I've got my problems with the midwit meme because I think it doesn't fit the Gaussian curve. And actually, if you look at the greatest things ever created, they typically fall in the outlier category that is beyond, the end of the Gaussian curve. And also, Taleb doesn't like Gaussian curves. But Fat Tony doesn't give a fuck whether you're intelligent or not. He just cares whether you're a sucker or not, as Taleb explains, and he made fucking $18 million. And obviously this is Taleb talking about himself. So if you're unsure, Taleb uses Fat Tony, Nero, Dr. John, like all of these different characters in his books, I think as, representations of his health. Yeah.
Representational elements of his character, because on one end he's the Fat Tony, he's the uncle with the hairy arms and the gold wrist chain or whatever, the wheeler dealer.
Yeah.
But on the other end he's the erudite of I can't remember the name of the other character. I think it's the Nero or the...
So basically you get this character that is able to operate in life where fragilistas would struggle to understand how that person operates. There's so many people like this that I can think of, especially because obviously we're like from Iranian backgrounds. So you get all these fat Iranian uncles who have somehow just made millions of dollars by like just living a life that you're like, how the fuck does this person even like, how? Like, I feel that I'm so much more intelligent than this person, but in reality, this is just the green lumber fallacy again. Is like you're just seeing what you can see as opposed to the information that's not there. So I find it so interesting that he's able to break down his character, his multiple personalities, and show that you can be a Nero and you can be a Fat Tony, and that's okay. Like you can be different things to different people, but still you can get rich and fat, which is evidently talking about himself.
In the next 10, 15 minutes, maybe let's slowly aim to wrap up this episode. Because then it's going to turn into... It's going to be longer than the audiobook itself. But here's the point, right? If you even try to listen to any of Taleb's books in audiobook format, good fucking luck. I tried like 30 times. Within the first chapter, I just gave up. Because these are books to be studied, not read for the millionth time. And I was just like, fuck this. Like, it's an insult to his work to begin with. You're not going to take anything profound in. So, anyway, a couple of last quotes from mine who are my favorites. In the book about optionality, technology, and the intelligence of antifragility, there is a chapter called History Written by the Losers. This is near the end of chapter 15. Taleb has a very crucial subsection which is called To Fail 7 Times plus or minus 2. And so in this whole chapter he's been talking a lot about a lot of points around optionality, technology, intelligence of antifragility. He touches on Matt Ridley's points, case in medicine, etc. But anyway, to wrap up this chapter, he writes, "Let me stop to issue rules based on the chapter so far." And by the way, Taleb never really gets prescriptive. But here, based on if you should read this chapter, you come to realize he gives a few points here. And I know some of you who listen to this or watch this are junkies salivating for some prescription. So here you go. Let me stop to issue rules based on the chapter so far. Number 1, look for optionality. In fact, rank things according to optionality. Number 2, preferably with open-ended, not close-ended payoffs. Number 3, do not invest in business plans, but in people. So look for someone capable of changing 6 or 7 times over his career, or more, an idea that is part of the modus operandi of the venture capitalist Mark Andreessen. One gets immunity from the backfit narratives of the business plan by investing in people. It is simply more robust to do so. Number 4, make sure you are barbelled, whatever that means in your business. It's a fucking lot to take in. But in a nutshell, hint, hint, do not invest in business plans, but invest in people. So when we do open our doors for investments, you should be investing in people. So he says, look for someone capable of changing 6 or 7 times. I think myself, I think Iman, I think we've changed enough shit. We've done so much different shit over the last few years that box is ticked. Make sure you are barbelled, whatever that means in your business. Sure. I'm always striving, we're always striving for point 1, 2, and 4. They're the difficult ones. Point 3, we've kind of been doing anyway naturally with careers, trying so many different things and projects and other stuff. So these are very good reminders. And it's so funny that he name drops the venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, the way he writes very formally. And Mark now is just like a Twitter bro with memes and a podcast, just like
us. But the funny thing is, I don't think he likes Mark Andreessen. Is Mark Andreessen blocked? Because I think there was something about a mathematical concept that Mark tweeted about, and Luke Burgess, a friend of the show who we've had on the podcast and we'll have on again, Luke Burgess replied in the comments atting Taleb. I don't know if I think Taleb responded in the end, but via Luke, not via Mark. But anyway, yeah, I don't know if they're friends anymore.
Yeah, I think once Mark said, "Oh no," because Taleb commented on some statistical thing.
No, I think he said something statistical, and then Luke Burgess was like, "Hey, I think this is one for Taleb to answer," and then he was like, "Oh shit, I'm gonna get shat on now." I want to make sure I make a nod to this because it's the very first line written in the actual prose of the book that comes in the prologue, and I've written here, "What a start to the book, purely emotive and nod to the classical ways of thinking that Taleb loves." And do you know what he's written? He writes one line, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 words long. He says, "Wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire." And then he goes into, "Likewise with randomness, uncertainty, chaos, you want to use them, not hide from them. You want to be the fire and wish for the wind." This summarizes this author's non-meek attitude to randomness and uncertainty. This is the first book I've read from Taleb where I understood what the fuck he was talking about from the off. I wasn't taken on some random, incredible story that nods to the classicists and history and all of this stuff, which I love and is exactly why we love Taleb. But it's the first time I was like, whoa, we're going straight into this, are we? Fucking hell, no foreplay, nothing.
Yeah, I really like that as well. So let's wrap up. Look, it's fucking 5.5 hours recording. It's 1:40 a.m., guys. Conclusion, chapter 25. So a lot of real ideas can be distilled down to a central issue that the great majority of people in a given field, by dint of specialization and empty-suitedness, completely miss. It's a golden rule. Don't do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. A central argument is never a summary. It is more like a generator. Shay's extraction was, everything gains or loses from volatility. Fragility is what loses from volatility and uncertainty. The glass on the table is short volatility.
And he also, there's this whole point around the best way to verify that you're alive is by checking that you like variations. Food wouldn't be tasteful, wouldn't be tasty if you weren't hungry. You wouldn't, results wouldn't matter without effort. Joy without sadness. Like, it's this whole point around stresses and variability that make life what it is. So never strip out your personal risk, essentially.
Exactly. And innovation is precisely something that gains from uncertainty, and some people sit around waiting for uncertainty and using it as raw material, just like our ancestral hunters. It so happens that everything non-linear is convex or concave, or both, depending on the intensity of the stressor. We saw the link between convexity and liking volatility, so everything likes or hates volatility up to a point. Everything. More technically, we may never get to know X, but we can play with the exposure to X. Barbell things to defang them. We can control a function of X, or fx is mathematical. Even if X remains vastly beyond our understanding, we can keep changing the function of X until we are comfortable with it by a mechanism called convex transformation, the fancier name for the barbell. So as we see, we keep coming back to the barbell here. Just wrapping up this entire book now with the last few sentences. He says, the short maxim also tells you where fragility supersedes truth, why we lie to children, why we humans got a bit ahead of ourselves in this large enterprise called modernity. Distributed randomness, as opposed to the concentrated type, is a necessity, not an option. Everything big is short volatility, so is everything fast. Big and fast are abominations. Modern times don't like volatility. And the triad if you recall, fragility, robust, antifragility, and the triad gives us some indication of what should be done to live in a world that does not want us to understand it, a world whose charm comes from our inability to truly understand it. And he wraps up the entire book with, The glass is dead. Living things are long volatility. The best way to verify that you are alive is by checking if you like variations. Remember that food would not have a taste if it weren't for hunger. Results are meaningless without effort, joy without sadness, convictions without uncertainty, and an ethical life isn't so when stripped of personal risks. And once again, reader, thank you for reading my book.
Phenomenal book. Absolutely, I would rate it 10 out of 10. Just absolutely integral to the way we think about life. The way he presents his ideas are so useful. It's so well written. It's so much less complicated a read than his two previous books, but still maintains that beautiful, very crisp, very humorous Talebian style in his writing. Very independent and different. And I mean, it's amazing. If you actually read the additional notes, the afterthoughts, and the further reading in the back of the book as well, you learn some insights about him as a person that I think identify why he writes in the way he does, and all of this good stuff. I mean, he talks about, since the Black Swan, he spent 1,150 days in physical seclusion, a soothing state of more than 300 days a year with minimal contact with the outside world, plus 20 years of thinking about the problem of non-linearities and non-linear exposures. So I've sort of lost patience with institutional and cosmetic knowledge. So like, you get an insight into how his writings developed over time, but why he's also so able to write with such power and authority in this space is because the guy's literally been studying this shit for at least 20 years in the real world and in theory. So he's just got this untouchable capability that not many other people do when it comes to talking about this stuff, and how he applies it to life is just unmatched. So I'm looking forward to skin in the game, but what a book this is, man.
Yeah, this was my favorite one so far. I think, yeah, it just is my favorite from the Inserto period. Skin in the Game is great as well. We're going to do that next. But that is a shorter book and hopefully not a 5-hour episode. And for me, it's 2 a.m. now. So any closing thoughts?
If you like this material, if you like these deep dives, look, we're not hitting Balaji level 8-hour episodes yet, but we are trying to be as authentic as possible when we create this content and create a notion of our experiences to the content that we read and we talk about. If you like what we're doing, go to rationalvc.com, sign up, and what you will receive is a Lindy letter, if you will, an overview of some of the core concepts of the book in the context of our lives and our experiences. And subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, as this really does help us.
Yeah, and on Spotify, once you hit the following, then please do rate us 5 stars if you enjoyed this. We do this for completely free, so we must be absolute fucking maniacs because we're operators in the tech industry. We're very busy with the jobs. We have a ton of other responsibilities. We go gym, usual stuff. Everyone has a life. But then outside of that, the limited time we have, you saw the amount of fucking sticky notes on these books. And these are not books to be, read. They're books to be studied. So it's like a 40-hour effort just for each episode. You include the post-production editing and all that stuff. It's like 50, 60 hours. And so we're not getting paid a single penny. If there is the only way you could repay us, just give us 5 stars on Spotify if you like it, if you want. And yeah, as Iman said, subscribe. Rationalvc.com. That's the place. Anything else, Iman?
No, but I am so sick and tired of your face and your massive head.
I don't blame you. I need a haircut, hence the hat. So I'm trying yet another new barber on Wednesday. Fucking hell. So save me. Pray for me.
You need to be more anti-fragile.
Okay, I might just shave it all off. Go and Andrew Tate. Shit.